Rhaegar's breath came hot against the visor of his helm, a ragged huff that told him he had already expended far too much energy. The river Trident lay before him, its waters swirling red with blood, a grim reflection of the sun sinking behind tattered clouds. The roar of battle curled around him in a cacophony of steel on steel, horses screaming, men bellowing their last curses as they fell. And at the center of it all, shining like a dark star on the battlefield, stood Robert Baratheon, his warhammer still stained from the gore of those foolish enough to stand in his way. Rhaegar recognized the cold determination in the rebel's eyes. It was not mere ambition that pushed Robert forward. It was the scorching fury of loss, the heartbreak at losing Lyanna Stark, whom Robert believed to be stolen from him, driving him to slaughter. Rhaegar Targaryen exhaled, feeling the weight of prophecy on his shoulders. It was for love and destiny that he had risked everything. If he failed now, the realm itself would bleed. He could not, would not, let that happen. The water lapped at the flanks of his destrier, the current swirling around the horse's legs, as if urging both mount and rider to retreat. But Rhaegar tightened his grip on his sword, silver bright and singing with the echoes of past battles. He spurred his horse forward. His voice emerged, muffled by the helm, but calm enough to steady those knights who remained loyal by his side. He saw Arthur Dayne fighting not far off, the legendary sword dawn flashing. Somewhere beyond, Prince Lewin Martell and other loyalists to House Targaryen strove to repel the storm of rebels. The course of the entire war, the fate of the monarchy, seemed to converge on this single moment. Robert's hammer arced in a savage sweep, sending one Targaryen bannerman clattering into the bloody shallows. Rhaegar urged his horse to turn, angling himself to face the enormous man who epitomized the wrath of the Stormlands. For an instant, Rhaegar remembered the quiet of the library at Dragonstone, the hush of reading prophecies by candlelight, the hush of studying ancient scrolls about the prince that was promised. Everything had pointed him here, to the Rubicon of choice where he might either seize destiny or let it slip from trembling fingers. Robert lifted his hammer in a one-handed challenge, chest heaving, face contorted with sweat and blood. Rhaegar knew that behind the fury there was heartbreak. He wanted to speak of it, to tell Robert the truth about Lyanna, about her will, her choices, but it was too late for words. The time for reason and diplomacy had drowned beneath the outraged war cries of both sides. Rhaegar's horse pranced, unsettled by the smell of death. He forced calm into his voice, though inside he felt the thunder of his own heart. "We end this now," he said, though perhaps only he and Robert could hear over the shrieking clamor. His silver-plated armor bore the three-headed dragon of House Targaryen across his chest, the rubies glittering like fresh blood in the dying light. And as Robert let out a roar, hurling himself forward, warhammer raised, Rhaegar spurred his mount to charge. The water erupted around them, and time seemed to slow to a trickle. He saw the lines in Robert's face, the twist of his mouth, the murder in his eyes. Then their weapons clashed with a noise that shook Rhaegar to the marrow. Steel vibrated in Rhaegar's hands as he parried the first blow, but Robert was unstoppable, a tidal force that hammered again and again. Rhaegar's arms ached from the weight of deflecting the savage strikes, each one strong enough to crush a man's skull. Adrenaline surged through Rhaegar's veins, quieting the throbbing in his shoulder where he had taken a minor wound earlier in the battle. Their mounts danced around each other, splashing water that mingled with the gore in dark rivulets. Across the field the fighting raged on, but for those within sight of the duel, it was as if the entire conflict narrowed to the single pivot: the Crown Prince of House Targaryen against the furious, unrelenting champion of the rebellion. The memory of Lyanna's face pulsed like a beacon in Rhaegar's mind. He thought of her tearful eyes, of the trembling kiss they'd shared in the quiet gloom of the Tower of Joy, the words she'd whispered that bound him to her. She was not merely a conquest. She was his destiny, his beloved, and their union was to be the hope for a broken world. He roared in defiance, turning Robert's next blow aside with a ringing clash. Then, pivoting his horse, Rhaegar lashed out, feeling his blade bite into steel and flesh. Robert grunted, staggering in the saddle. It was the first time in this war Rhaegar had truly felt the advantage. He pressed forward, eyes narrowed, sword raised. He could see the raw, open hatred flicker across Robert's face. The rebel's next strike hammered into Rhaegar's shield so hard it splintered the metal, jarring the bones in Rhaegar's forearm. Rhaegar winced, grit his teeth, and struck again with fluid grace, forcing Robert to twist his thick torso awkwardly to block. Their weapons clashed in a crescendo of sparks, and for a heartbeat they were so close Rhaegar could taste the blood misting in the air. He saw Robert snarl. The man was unstoppable, a juggernaut of vengeance. Again Robert swung, but this time he overextended. Rhaegar seized the moment. With a swift pivot he sliced his sword upward. It cut through Robert's breastplate near the shoulder, drawing a wet, ragged gasp from the man. Blood streamed down Robert's left arm, but the rebel only let out a guttural roar of rage. Desperation lent strength to his next blow. With a mighty heave, Robert brought the warhammer down on Rhaegar's horse. The beast screamed, its legs buckling under the savage impact. Rhaegar tumbled to the churned mud of the riverbank, rolling and coming to his feet with cat-like grace, sword held at the ready. His horse collapsed beside him, its breathing labored. A hiss of sorrow cut through Rhaegar's mind, but there was no time for empathy on the battlefield. Robert, too, dismounted, stumbling as his injured arm trembled. He spat blood, clutched the warhammer in both hands, and charged. They met in a flurry of steel, Rhaegar's sword weaving an elegant dance, Robert's hammer smashing with unstoppable brutality. Time lost all meaning. Rhaegar felt the nicks and bruises accumulate on his arms, chest, ribs, as Robert's hammer collided with his armor. But he was faster, more precise, and he stepped aside from a crushing blow to bury his blade in Robert's side. The rebel let out a choked cry. Staggering. For an instant, his grip slackened. Rhaegar drew back the sword, the blade slick with blood, and with a final desperate swing, he cut Robert across the chest. The blow sent Robert sprawling backward, his hammer falling from numb fingers to the bloody water. Breathing raggedly, Rhaegar lifted his visor. His face was spattered with grime and sweat, strands of silver hair clinging to his cheeks. Robert Baratheon lay before him, struggling to inhale as red bubbles frothed at his lips. The battlefield around them fell eerily silent in that moment, as men on both sides realized that the rebels' greatest champion had been cut down. The hush seemed to tremble in the air, broken only by Robert's ragged breathing and the distant cries of the wounded. Rhaegar stared down at the man who had threatened everything he loved, who might have succeeded in tearing the realm apart. Pity and regret warred in Rhaegar's heart. How had it come to this? He knelt, ignoring the protests of his own battered body. "Robert," he said quietly, uncertain if the man could even hear him. But Robert's eyes moved, flickering to the Targaryen prince's face. In them Rhaegar glimpsed not just hate, but heartbreak. He knew, in a different world, they might have been allies, even friends. But destiny had chosen a blood-soaked path. "It's over," Rhaegar continued. "Lay down your arms." Robert coughed, a ragged, wet sound. "Over," he echoed, the word bitter. His hand moved feebly, seeking the warhammer that lay beyond his reach. Defiance still burned in his eyes. But he had lost a frightening amount of blood, and his strength was slipping away like water cupped in a broken palm. Rhaegar leaned closer, uncertain if he should offer mercy or steel. Before he could decide, Robert's eyes closed, and his head tilted to the side. Rhaegar pressed 2 fingers to the man's neck, feeling the faint flutter of a pulse. The hush around them broke. Shouts erupted from the Targaryen loyalists, jubilant roars of victory, while many of Robert's allies stood as if stunned, grief-stricken, or enraged. Some tried to surge forward, but Arthur Dayne and the Kingsguard formed a defensive line around their prince. Rhaegar rose and gestured for the maesters, or any healers present to see to Robert's wounds. Whatever the future held, Rhaegar did not wish to begin it with cruelty. He had shed the man's blood. He would not deny him a chance to live. Exhaustion sank into Rhaegar's bones. The war had pivoted on this duel. The rebels had lost their figurehead, and in the violent swirl of rumor that followed, many surrendered. Some broke rank and fled, while others simply sank to their knees, dazed by defeat. The loyalists, bloodied and battered, mustered up cheer for the crown prince. Cries of Targaryen mingled with a renewed sense of triumph. The sun dipped below the horizon, and in its dying glow, Rhaegar stood amid the churned mud, the battered bodies of friend and foe alike, feeling as though the world had cracked open around him. When the skirmishes had died and the wounded had been carried away, Rhaegar surveyed the aftermath. Bodies floated in the shallow water, limp and broken. The stench of death was overwhelming. For all his talk of prophecy, Rhaegar was not immune to the horror of war. Perhaps it was a necessary step to fulfill some cosmic plan, but he felt each loss as a personal failing. He dismounted a borrowed horse. His own had to be put down, and passed orders for the wounded to receive aid, rebel or loyalist. Then he glanced at Arthur Dayne, who approached with solemnity etched on his face. "It's done," Arthur said. "The day is yours." His expression was tight, as if he too wrestled with the price they had paid. Dawn hung at his hip, its legendary blade unstained. A weapon of such fine steel rarely retained blood for long. "Your father will be pleased." Rhaegar winced at that, a subtle flicker of pain crossing his features. The Mad King, heiress to Targaryen, had grown increasingly unstable, prone to violent paranoia that had alienated many of the great houses. This war was not solely about Lyanna Stark. It was about a kingdom pushed to the brink by Aerys's tyranny. Rhaegar had hoped to find a diplomatic solution, to remove his father from power peacefully and replace him with a more benevolent Targaryen rule. But events had spiraled beyond control. Now, with Robert Baratheon defeated, the rebellion had lost its most passionate champion, though Ned Stark and Jon Arryn still loomed as threats. Still, Rhaegar had a chance to mend the realm, if he could subdue the madness in King's Landing. He turned his gaze to the north, even though the Tower of Joy lay far to the south. His heart drew him to Lyanna, to the promise they shared. Word would have to be sent. The realm must know that the tide had turned, that Rhaegar remained to forge a new future, a future in which Lyanna Stark would stand by his side as queen, their union sealing the old wounds between the North and the Iron Throne. The thought both excited and terrified him. He had loved her with a fervor that burned away caution. Now, in the smoky twilight, with the stench of corpses in his nostrils, he found himself wondering if the realm would ever forgive the betrayal it perceived. He lowered his head, offering a silent prayer to the Seven that the cost of this victory might serve some greater good. Then, summoning what regal bearing he could muster, he gave commands for the knights to gather prisoners. See to the wounded, and prepare for a march to King's Landing. One battle had been won, but the war for the soul of the Seven Kingdoms was far from over. As the Targaryen host made its slow progress south, the wheels of fate turned with ponderous inevitability. Ravens flew from the trident in all directions, carrying the news of Robert Baratheon's defeat. Some messages boasted that Robert had fallen mortally wounded, while others claimed he still drew breath. Conflicting rumors spread through taverns and holdfasts alike, fueling both hope and dread. The name Rhaegar Targaryen took on renewed force among the small folk. Some saw him as a gallant prince, beloved of the common man, one who had shown mercy to the rebel leader, even in victory. Others scorned him as a villain who had stolen away a high-born lady and sparked a war of chaos and bloodshed. Yet no matter the perspective, everyone sensed that the shape of the realm had changed. In the heart of King's Landing, the Red Keep loomed over the city like a crimson sentinel. Aerys II Targaryen stood on a balcony of Maegor's Holdfast, gazing at the scuttling activity below with feverish, darting eyes. He was not pleased by the tidings that his son had offered mercy to the traitors, and that Robert Baratheon yet lived under guard. Dark rumors infested the royal court. Whispers spoke of how the king's mania deepened each day. They said he demanded wildfire to be stockpiled, that the city's gates and towers bristled with archers who had orders to fire on any who approached suspiciously. Varys the spymaster scuttled through the halls like a whisper, reporting everything and nothing. Pycelle, the Grand Maester, wrung his hands, struggling to placate an increasingly erratic monarch. Jaime Lannister stood watch by the throne, Still a newly made Kingsguard, golden-haired and handsome, yet troubled by the oaths he had sworn to a king he knew to be mad. When Rhaegar's host approached the city gates, tensions were high. But Aerys did not dare bar entry to his own heir, for it was clear the prince commanded the loyalty of many knights and houses who had supported the crown only for Rhaegar's sake. Once inside, Rhaegar wasted no time. He saw that Robert was carefully tended by maesters. The man lingered in a delirious state, muttering Lyanna's name. Rhaegar ensured that the healers did all they could to preserve him. For a man so ill-fated a week prior, Robert clung to life with surprising ferocity, though it was uncertain if he would ever wield a warhammer again. Rhaegar strode the familiar corridors of the Red Keep, passing tapestries depicting the Targaryen conquest. He was acutely aware that the next few weeks would decide whether Westeros would descend into further bloodshed or find a tenuous peace. Up the grand stone steps he walked, knights in Targaryen armor parting before him until he reached the throne room's towering doors. Inside, the hall stretched like a cavern of gloom, dust motes drifting in the shafts of light from narrow windows. At the far end, upon the Iron Throne, a mass of twisted swords melted together by dragonfire, sat Aerys II, clad in black robes that only accentuated his gaunt frame and wild, unkempt hair. Aerys's eyes gleamed as Rhaegar approached, flanked by Arthur Dayne and Lewyn Martell, both battered from the war but steadfast in their loyalty. "You return triumphant," Aerys hissed, voice echoing off the walls. "But you bring our enemy in chains, still breathing. Is that how you honor your king?" Spit flecked his mouth as he gestured erratically. "I would have had his head on a spike by now. I would make an example of him and all who defied us." Rhaegar stopped a respectful distance from the throne. He knelt only briefly, enough to maintain protocol, then rose. "Father," he said, "Robert Baratheon is beaten. His cause is ended. If we execute him, we risk turning him into a martyr. The realm has bled enough. This is the time for mercy, so that the remaining rebels might see reason and bend the knee." "Nendawal." Aerys cackled, a mad, rattling laughter that sent a chill through the courtiers. "Mercy," he said, leaning forward until the sharp edges of the Iron Throne threatened to prick his skin. "Mercy is a weakness. They rose against the crown, boy. They spat on our name. Burn them all, I say." Rhaegar had seen his father's madness before, but never so clearly. He had to tread carefully. "If we slaughter all who opposed us, the realm will never heal," he said, voice measured. He glanced around at the courtiers, many of whom nodded discreetly, for they had pinned their hopes on the prince. "We must bind the wounds, father, or the kingdom will remain forever in turmoil." Aerys' mouth twitched, his eyes flaring with suspicion. "You speak to me of loyalty and healing, yet you played a part in starting this war with your abduction of that Stark girl. You dare advise me now on the realm's welfare?" His voice rose to an unhinged pitch. "You conspire against me, my own son. I know the voices whisper in the walls. They say you mean to steal the throne from me. They say you fancy yourself a better king. Do you?" "Then the one." Rhaegar felt the sting of his father's accusations. He kept his tone soft. "I want only what is best for the Seven Kingdoms, father. You remain king, and I remain your loyal heir. But I ask that you trust me on this. A measured approach now will avert greater bloodshed tomorrow." For a moment, silence reigned in the throne room, tension coiling. Aerys seemed to weigh Rhaegar's words, or at least pretend to. Then the king gave a shrill laugh, rising from the throne with a disturbing grace. "We shall see," he said, his voice echoing. "We shall see who truly speaks for the realm. I will allow this mercy for now. But if the rebels do not bend the knee, if the lords do not flock to proclaim their loyalty once more, I will fill the streets with wildfire. Tell them that, Rhaegar. Tell them all." Rhaegar inclined his head, feeling a mixture of relief and dread. He did not press further, for to do so might provoke a worse outburst. He retreated from the throne room with Arthur and Lewyn at his side, both silent in the face of the king's madness. Outside in the hallway, Rhaegar let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Aerys was balanced on a knife's edge between reason and insanity, and at any moment, the realm could topple into chaos. When Rhaegar emerged into the courtyard, Knights and courtiers flocked to him, offering congratulations and seeking favor. He kept his responses polite, but his mind was elsewhere. He had won the battlefield, but not the war. He had to ensure that Ned Stark and the remaining rebels would stand down. He had to keep his father's wrath contained. He had to protect Lyanna, who waited for him at the Tower of Joy, guarded by trusted knights. And he had to quell the swirling rumors that threatened to tear the realm apart once more. He spent the following days sending out ravens, forging alliances, granting clemency to those who pledged fealty anew. Jon Arryn, Stannis Baratheon, and Ned Stark remained the most critical. Of those, Ned Stark was the one closest to Rhaegar's heart, albeit indirectly. If Ned refused to yield, the bloodshed would continue. Yet Rhaegar held hope that Ned, upon learning the truth of Lyanna's choice, might relent. The North was proud, but also honorable. Rhaegar believed that Ned's honor might be the key to forging peace. It was a week before Rhaegar felt secure enough to leave King's Landing, and in that time, the city bubbled with rumors of the Targaryen victory, with fear of the king's madness, and with whispered tales of the Stark girl who had bewitched the prince. Under the watchful eyes of Sir Arthur Dayne and a small retinue of loyal knights, Rhaegar rode out. His destination, the Tower of Joy, nestled in the Red Mountains of Dorne. Lyanna Stark remained there, under the protection of Sir Gerald Hightower and Sir Oswell Went, who had stood guard by the prince's command. Word had been sent ahead that Rhaegar would come in person, seeking to bring Lyanna to King's Landing as his acknowledged consort. And once the High Septon could be convinced, or coerced, she would be his queen. The journey took him across the sun-scorched Dornish sands, through jagged passes where the wind howled. During those lonely stretches, Rhaegar's mind returned to the haunted look in Robert Baratheon's eyes, to the final moment of the battle when Rhaegar's blade bit deep. He wondered if Robert still lingered in some fever dream, cursing the Targaryen name. He wondered if the realm could ever reconcile this chain of betrayals and heartbreak. Some nights he could not sleep, plagued by nightmares of fire and blood, a prophecy unfulfilled, a child promised by the union of ice and fire. He could not banish the fear that all he had done might be in vain. At last, the Tower of Joy rose before him, a solitary structure of pale stone, set against the stark brilliance of the sky. It seemed both welcoming and forbidding. Rhaegar approached with a mixture of excitement and dread. He remembered the night he had first brought Lyanna here, the quiet determination in her eyes, the vow they exchanged before the old gods and the new, that they would stand together. He dismounted, leaving his horse in the care of a squire, and climbed the stone steps alone. Arthur Dayne waited below, understanding that this moment belonged to the prince and his beloved. Inside the tower, a hush blanketed the corridors. Torchlight flickered along the stone walls, casting dancing shadows. Rhaegar found her in a small chamber overlooking the desert, the window open to let in a warm breeze. Lyanna Stark stood with her back to the doorway, dark hair falling in gentle waves down her shoulders. She wore a simple gown of pale blue, the color of a winter sky. Rhaegar paused, overwhelmed by the sight of her. She was no longer the girl he had glimpsed at the tourney at Harrenhal. War and the rumors swirling about her name had changed her. There was a solemnity in the line of her shoulders, a maturity in her posture. When she turned, their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then she drew in a quiet breath, her lips parting in relief, disbelief, and a dozen other emotions. "You're alive," she whispered. He closed the distance between them, taking her hands in his. The warmth of her skin felt more precious than any crown. "I am," he answered, voice thick. "Robert is defeated. The war, I hope, is ending." Wow. She studied his face, searching for signs of the man she had fallen in love with amid stolen glances and whispered promises. She touched a bruise on his cheek, the shadow of a wound on his neck. "You've paid a high price." "The realm has," he said, anguish flickering in his eyes. "But we can still make it mean something. We can still build the future we dreamed of." Her gaze flickered to the window. He followed her look. The sun was setting beyond the Red Mountains, bathing the sand in a red-gold glow. "I never wanted a war in my name," Lyanna murmured. "I never wanted Robert or my family to suffer. But I couldn't live in a lie. I couldn't stand by and let them choose for me." She squeezed Rhaegar's hand. "The blood spilled. It weighs on me. But if there's a way to bring peace, I want to help you find it." Rhaegar inclined his head, a faint smile curving his lips. This was why he loved her, why he believed their union was more than mere prophecy. She had the strength of the North and a heart that yearned for justice. "We'll stand together," he vowed. "I have made arrangements for you to be brought to King's Landing." "My father." He remains king in name, but his grip on reality loosens. "To save the realm, I may need to assume power sooner than I'd hoped." "Many Samo." Lyanna nodded, a tremor in her voice. "What will happen to my brother Ned? To the North? To all those who rose up for my sake?" Rhaegar's jaw tightened. "I've offered clemency, but they must accept peace and bend the knee to the crown. Some have agreed, some have yet to respond. If Ned continues to fight, it will tear the realm apart again." "I don't believe he will," Lyanna said. "Ned is honorable, but he loves his family above all else. He'll want to see me safe. Once he knows you haven't forced me, that I stand by you of my own free will, I think he'll lay down arms." "Menso." "Then let us hope. The realm has had enough of war." He drew her into an embrace, pressing his forehead against hers. In that quiet moment, the burdens of prophecy and duty receded, leaving only the warmth of their connection. Outside, the last traces of dusk gave way to the starlit night. Lyanna closed her eyes, allowing herself to rest in the calm of his presence, knowing the storm that waited beyond these walls. They departed the Tower of Joy with a small escort, traveling by discreet paths. Lyanna covered her dark hair and kept her head bowed in public, for they were not eager to court further scandal until Rhaegar could secure the High Septon's blessing, or at least his acquiescence, to annul Rhaegar's marriage to Elia Martell and forge a new union. Elia herself was under the protection of the royal court. She was a gentle soul, beloved by many, but her health was often frail. She had borne Rhaegar 2 children, Rhaenys and Aegon. The question of their inheritance complicated matters. Rhaegar grappled with guilt and the knowledge that in the Game of Thrones, personal desires rarely came without cost. Still, he believed the realm's salvation hinged on his bond with Lyanna. He sought a way to honor Elia while uniting ice and fire in a single lineage. Word reached them that Ned Stark and Jon Arryn were marching south, but not to wage war. Instead, they requested a parley. This news soothed Rhaegar's fears. Perhaps reason would prevail. But he also learned that Tywin Lannister, the cunning lord of Casterly Rock, had begun gathering forces around the Crownlands. Tywin had once served as Hand of the King, but his relations with Aerys had soured disastrously. No one knew if Tywin intended to exploit the situation for his own gain. Tensions in the realm still ran high, and the wrong provocation could spark fresh bloodshed. At last, Rhaegar and Lyanna neared the outskirts of King's Landing, traveling by night to avoid too many prying eyes. They reached the city gates as dawn broke over the horizon, the sky tinted with a pale pink glow. Lyanna gazed upon the sprawling capital, her expression a mixture of dread and awe. She had never seen so many people in one place, nor breathed in such a potent melange of odors: fish from the Blackwater Rush, smoke from countless hearths, and the press of unwashed bodies in the slums. The Red Keep rose on Aegon's high hill like a fortress of secrets. Rhaegar's hand tightened on hers. The time for secrecy was over. When they passed through the gates of the Red Keep, a hush settled over the courtyard. Guards froze, astonished. Stable hands gawked as they dismounted. Arthur Dayne announced Rhaegar's arrival, and servants rushed to guide them in. Lyanna felt the weight of 1,000 stares, the swirl of whispered gossip. She kept her chin high, though her heart pounded in her chest. Rhaegar led her through corridors hung with tapestries depicting Targaryen victories. At each turn, she glimpsed the wonder and distrust on the faces of those they passed. They reached a private solar where Elia Martell awaited them with her children. Rhaegar paused outside the door, turning to Lyanna. "Elia is kind," he said softly. "But this will be difficult for her. For all of us." Lyanna took a steadying breath. She remembered the moment she'd first met Elia at Harrenhal. How the princess had seemed quiet and noble, her dark eyes gentle. "I know," Lyanna whispered. "If there's a path to treat her and her children with respect, I will follow it." She deserves that. They entered the solar. The space was bright, the tall windows admitting the first rays of morning. Elia Martell rose from a cushioned chair, dressed in a deep purple gown that contrasted with her olive skin. Rhaenys, a sweet-faced girl with big brown eyes, clung to her mother's side, while baby Aegon dozed in a cradle. At the sight of Rhaegar, Rhaenys lit up, but then her gaze flicked uncertainly to Lyanna. Elia's face betrayed a storm of emotions, though she managed a polite bow of her head. "Princess Elia," Rhaegar greeted softly, stepping forward. He offered a hand to Rhaenys, who took it eagerly, babbling a greeting. Turning to Elia, he continued, "I've returned with Lady Lyanna Stark. We seek to—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Resolve matters peaceably, with honor for all." A flicker of pain crossed Elia's eyes, but her voice remained composed. "I feared the worst when I heard of the war's toll. I'm relieved you survived, Rhaegar." She studied Lyanna, her gaze unreadable. "And Lady Lyanna, I pray these troubles can be put to rest." Lyanna mustered her courage. "Princess," she said, keeping her tone respectful, "I know this situation is not of your choosing. I am sorry for the hurt it has caused. If I can do anything to ease it, I will." She looked at the children, her chest tight. So much hinged on their lives, their futures. Elia's lips trembled. She nodded but did not speak. The air felt heavy with unspoken truths. Finally, Rhaegar took a gentle breath. "Elia, the realm stands on a precipice. My father's madness grows. The rebellion has fractured, but if we do not unify the lords under a stable throne, more blood will be shed. You know the prophecy I have long studied, the prince that was promised. I believe that child will come from the union of ice and fire. It is my duty to see it fulfilled." His words hung in the air. Elia closed her eyes briefly. "You think that child cannot be mine?" It was not a question, but a statement of sorrow. Rhaegar bowed his head. "I do not claim to know the gods' plan for certain. I only know what my heart and the old texts tell me. You remain under the protection of House Targaryen, and your children shall always have my love and care. But I must wed Lyanna for the good of the realm." Elia's breath shuddered. Then, in a show of quiet dignity, she straightened her shoulders. "I will not stand in the way, but I ask that you keep me and my children safe, that you do not allow the court to scorn us as cast-offs." Lyanna's voice interjected softly. "I will not let that happen. You and your children will be honored. This is not about replacing you. It is about forging a bond that might save this realm from further ruin." "Then see." Elia offered a fragile smile. "I appreciate your kindness. Perhaps in time we can both serve the realm in our own ways." Rhaegar pressed a tender kiss to Elia's hand, then to Rhaenys' head. A swirl of conflicting emotions clouded his face. He would have to seek the High Septon's agreement to annul his marriage to Elia, a matter complicated by politics and moral scrutiny. Yet it had to be done, for if Rhaegar wed Lyanna while still married to Elia, many lords would call it treasonous, an abomination in the eyes of the Seven. He steeled himself, one step at a time. Within days, courtiers and noble lords buzzed with news that Ned Stark and Jon Arryn had arrived at the gates of King's Landing, accompanied by a modest retinue. Rhaegar made sure they were welcomed, not seized. The day they entered the Red Keep was tense. As Ned Stark strode into the throne room, Rhaegar caught sight of the guarded anguish in his gray eyes. Ned's face was drawn, his jaw set. He looked a mirror of his sister in certain angles, the same steely resolve. Aerys presided over the meeting, perched on the Iron Throne with a mocking grin. But Rhaegar stood at the foot of the throne, a silent promise that reason would hold sway. Ned Stark knelt stiffly, Jon Arryn at his side. Ned's gaze flicked past the king, landing briefly on Rhaegar. There was no warmth there, only the lingering bitterness of betrayal. "Your Grace," Ned said, voice low. I come to seek peace. I've been told, my sister as well, that she was not taken against her will. Is this true? Nenderho. Rhaegar inclined his head. It is true. She resides here now, of her own choice. She will confirm it if you wish. Ned's throat worked as he swallowed hard. I do wish it. I will not accept any arrangement until I hear it from her own lips. Aerys made a disdainful sound, but Rhaegar glanced at him meaningfully. The king waved a bony hand. Very well. Show the wolf that his sister is no prisoner. But the next time you question the crown's word, I'll have your head. The threat bristled in the air. Rhaegar escorted Ned to a private audience in a smaller chamber. Lyanna was already there, guarded only by Arthur Dayne, whose presence was more symbolic than threatening. When Ned saw Lyanna, his composure cracked. He rushed to her side, checking her face and arms for injuries. Lyanna pressed a calming hand on his shoulder, tears glistening. She assured him she was unharmed, that she had chosen this path freely. Ned's relief warred with his anger. He demanded to know why, how she could have done this. She spoke of love, of prophecy, of her refusal to be bartered into a marriage she did not want. Ned's face remained etched with worry. But when all was said, Ned bowed his head in acceptance. He did not like it. He might never forgive Rhaegar fully for the strife and bloodshed. Yet seeing Lyanna safe, and learning that Robert was not killed outright, quieted his fiercest animosity. Jon Arryn, more pragmatic, recognized that continuing the rebellion was futile. He counseled Ned to submit formally, to spare the North and the Vale from further devastation. Thus, in the grand throne room where so recently swords had clashed, Ned Stark bent the knee. I pledge my loyalty to the crown, he said, voice echoing. For my sister's sake, and for the good of the realm. Rhaegar felt a surge of gratitude and sorrow, all at once. He knew how costly that gesture was for Ned, and he swore to repay the trust with fairness. Even Aerys, perched on the throne, seemed momentarily pacified, though Rhaegar suspected that behind the king's eyes, dark thoughts brewed. Peace settled over King's Landing with fragile wings, easily startled. Messages were sent to the lords of the North, the Vale, the Stormlands, inviting them to reaffirm their fealty. Most complied, relieved by Robert's survival and Ned's submission. Tywin Lannister remained watchful, but he did not move openly against the crown. Meanwhile, the High Septon arrived to address the question of Rhaegar's marriage. Aerys' own precarious sanity made him pliable in this matter. He wanted to keep Prince Doran Martell appeased by promising Aelia's continued dignity, and at the same time, he favored whatever arrangement kept Rhaegar from turning traitor. Thus, with enough political maneuvering and gold exchanged, an annulment was granted by the faith. Aelia, however, retained an honored station, and her children were acknowledged as Targaryen royals, though not direct heirs above any children Rhaegar might have with Lyanna. All was prepared for the new wedding. The realm held its breath. Some thought it scandalous that a Targaryen prince would set aside his lawful princess for a northern girl. Others whispered prophecies, saying the old magic of the first men and the blood of the dragon would forge a mighty lineage. In taverns and market squares, small folk spoke of Rhaegar's mercy to Robert, of the truce with the North, of the hush that now lay over a once warring kingdom. Some hoped that Rhaegar would soon ascend the throne and bring an end to Aerys' tyranny. The wedding day dawned under ominous skies, gray clouds looming over King's Landing. A faint drizzle fell, though the warmth of the summer sun lingered behind the clouds. The ceremony took place in the great sept of Baelor, a lavish affair of silver, gold, and crystal. Lords and ladies filled the pews, their silks rustling and jewels flashing in the candlelight. At the altar, Rhaegar waited in resplendent attire. Black and red robes embroidered with the three-headed dragon. His silver hair was braided back, revealing sharp, noble features. A hush fell when Lyanna Stark entered, her gown a shimmering white with subtle accents of gray fur. She wore no crown yet, but her presence commanded attention. Many lords noted the quiet determination in her gray eyes, the regal tilt of her chin. They stood before the High Septon, who intoned the ancient rites. Candles burned, incense curled in the air. When the vows were exchanged, Rhaegar's voice was firm, Lyanna's steady. Their clasped hands were bound with ribbon, symbolizing the union that would link the old blood of the North with the storied legacy of Valyria. Outside the sept, the drizzle intensified, pattering on the leaded glass windows. Some in attendance murmured that rain on a wedding day was good fortune. Others saw it as an ill omen. But Rhaegar and Lyanna had eyes only for each other in that moment, determined to mold their future from the ashes of war. When the High Septon pronounced them man and wife, applause rippled through the gathering. The lords in attendance rose to greet their new crown princess, though the air was still thick with uncertainty. Lyanna's expression was solemn, reflecting the enormous responsibility she had taken on. Rhaegar bent to kiss her, a brief, tender gesture that sealed the union in the eyes of all. For better or worse, the Seven Kingdoms now had a Targaryen prince wed to a Stark bride. The wedding feast that followed was a study in contrasts. There was music, dancing, the aroma of roast boar and lemon cakes. But over it all loomed the quiet knowledge that King Aerys had not relinquished the throne. He sat at the high table, half ignored by the lords who flocked instead around Rhaegar and Lyanna. Aerys watched his son and new daughter-in-law with narrowed eyes, occasionally muttering to Pycelle or Varys. Despite the festive atmosphere, tensions churned beneath the surface. Lyanna, seated beside Rhaegar, tried to manage her unease. She had grown up at Winterfell, far from the intrigues of court. Yet she had always been bold, unafraid of speaking her mind. Now, out of respect for the precarious peace, she forced herself to keep her voice tempered, to wear a polite smile when courtiers approached. Lords from the Riverlands and Westerlands offered their congratulations. Doran Martell expressed best wishes, but also concern for his sister Elia. Lyanna assured him she would never displace Elias' dignity. She noticed Ned in a corner with Jon Arryn and some other northern lords. He gave her a nod of acknowledgement, but his face betrayed his discomfort. When the feast ended, and the merriment gave way to the wedding's bedding tradition, Rhaegar quietly signaled his desire for privacy. He would not subject Lyanna to the humiliating custom of being carried off in front of jeering crowds. Most lords grumbled but relented, for no one wished to offend the crown prince on his wedding day. Rhaegar escorted Lyanna from the hall, ignoring the raucous suggestions hurled at them. Once they were alone in a lavish bedchamber, he held her close, sensing her tension. She sighed against his shoulder. Is it always like this at court? So many eyes. So much speculation? Then so. A weary chuckle escaped him. Yes, but we'll manage. Once my father passes or is removed, we'll do things differently. I promise you that. She nodded, lifting her gaze to meet his. I hope so. For all our sakes. Outside, the rain continued to fall, a soft lullaby against the stone walls. In that private chamber, they whispered their hopes and fears, forging a bond not just of flesh, but of shared ambition, to bring forth a new era for the realm, one free of tyranny and strife. And if the ancient prophecies were correct, their child would be the promise of a better tomorrow. Over the following months, the atmosphere in King's Landing alternated between tentative calm and sudden spikes of tension. Aerys grew more volatile. He sneered at court sessions, once even threatening to burn the hand who dared question his decrees. Rhaegar spent more time in the council chambers, working with trusted advisors. Arthur Dayne, Varys, Jon Arryn, even Tywin Lannister, who had returned to the city under a guise of reconciliation. Ned Stark lingered only a short while before he departed for Winterfell, hoping to restore order to the north. He left behind a vow of friendship, albeit a strained one, promising to rally northern lords to accept Rhaegar's rule if Rhaegar could ensure their right to govern themselves with a measure of autonomy. As the year turned, Lyanna's belly began to swell. Word spread that she carried the prince's heir. This news electrified the realm. Merchants in Flea Bottom placed bets on whether the child would have silver hair or the dark features of the Starks. Seers and mystics claimed that the child would fulfill ancient prophecies and defend the realm against an unnamed darkness. Elia Martell remained at court, but withdrew from the public eye, focusing her energies on her own children. She remained polite to Lyanna, though a sadness lingered between them. Rhaegar, for his part, found renewed purpose in his impending fatherhood. He continued his efforts to broker alliances, extend mercy, and rebuild trust in the monarchy. Some lords criticized his policies, calling them too lenient. Others embraced his more measured approach, relieved by the absence of royal purges. But the greatest threat remained King Aerys himself. Rumors abounded that the king had secret stashes of wildfire placed throughout the city. On more than one occasion, Rhaegar confronted his father about these rumors, only to be met with deranged laughter and cryptic remarks. Aerys increasingly kept to his private chambers, speaking only with a handful of sycophantic courtiers. At times, Rhaegar wondered if he should act swiftly, stage a coup, remove his father from the throne before a catastrophe occurred. Yet doubt hounded him. Was it not kinslaying, a dreadful sin, to depose one's own father? He worried that such an act might fracture the realm anew. So he bided his time, hoping to build enough consensus among the great lords to ensure a smooth transition. The day came when Lyanna went into labor. Early morning sunlight pierced the windows of her chamber, revealing her pale, tense face. Maids and midwives bustled around. A maester stood ready, conferring with anxious courtiers in the hallway. Rhaegar paced just beyond the door, heart pounding. Elia Martell surprised everyone by arriving with soothing herbs she had once used for her own labors. She quietly instructed the midwives, her expression grave. In the corridor, Arthur Dane and Jon Arryn offered Rhaegar words of comfort. At midday, a child's cry shattered the silence. Rhaegar rushed in, ignoring propriety, to see Lyanna lying exhausted on the bed, hair damp with sweat. In her arms rested a tiny infant, eyes closed, cheeks reddened. A boy, as the maester confirmed with gentle pride. The child let out another wail, fierce and insistent, a spark of life that sent a tremor through Rhaegar's chest. With tears in his eyes, he knelt by the bed, placing a trembling hand on his son's downy head. Lyanna looked at Rhaegar with a mixture of exhaustion and wonder. "He's here," she whispered. "Our son." Rhaegar closed his eyes, fighting back tears. The weight of prophecy, love, and duty crashed over him. This fragile life was the living bond between North and South, between ice and fire. The realm's future might well hinge on his tiny shoulders. Rhaegar leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to Lyanna's forehead, then to the child's. "Welcome to the world," he murmured to his son. "You have a great destiny before you." That evening, a formal announcement was made to the court. Crown Prince Rhaegar Targaryen and his lady wife, Lyanna Stark, had been blessed with a son. The bells of the city rang out in a joyful peal. Small folk thronged the streets, cheering for the new prince. In taverns, cups were raised in toasts. The lords of the realm sent tokens of goodwill. Even King Aerys made a fleeting appearance in Lyanna's chambers, though his manner was jittery, his eyes never quite meeting his grandson's. He muttered something about Targaryen blood and the purity of the line, but left before Lyanna could speak. They named the child Aemon Targaryen, after the Targaryen kings and princes of old who had borne the name with honor. He had wisps of pale hair that seemed caught between silver and a darker hue. Lyanna insisted he had the shape of a Stark's face, though Rhaegar teased that Aemon's nose was decidedly Targaryen. Despite the swirl of court politics, for a short while, they found a measure of peace. Cherishing their son's first days, it was not to last. Tension frayed around the edges of King's Landing. Aerys raved about traitors lurking in every shadow. He demanded that Tywin Lannister prove his loyalty by sending gold to bolster the royal treasury. He commanded that the City Watch double their patrols, scanning for conspirators. Rhaegar pleaded for calm, but the king's rages escalated. Late one night, a captain of the City Watch was found burnt alive near the dragon pit, wildfire residue at the scene. The king offered no explanation. Whispers spread like wildfire themselves, and fear gripped the nobles. In this climate, Tywin Lannister saw an opportunity. He began quietly marshalling more soldiers near the capital, under the pretense of safeguarding the king. Varys alerted Rhaegar, hinting that Tywin might be preparing to enforce a transition of power by force if Aerys pushed too far. The realm teetered on the brink of another violent upheaval. Rhaegar held his son in his arms late one night, gazing at the sleeping infant's peaceful face. Lyanna dozed nearby, dark circles under her eyes from the strain of new motherhood. Arthur Dayne stood guard outside. Rhaegar's heart pounded with the enormity of the decision he knew he had to make. The realm could not endure further madness. If Aerys persisted, thousands might burn. Dragons or no dragons, it was the duty of a king to protect his people, not destroy them. Resolve hardened in Rhaegar's eyes. He whispered, a soft vow to his son. I will not let you inherit a kingdom drenched in blood. The next day, Rhaegar convened a secret council. Jon Arryn, Arthur Dayne, Tywin Lannister, Varys and a handful of others whose loyalty he trusted. They discussed the need for Aerys to be removed from power, but they disagreed on how to achieve it. Some argued for a swift coup, possibly involving the assassination of the king to prevent him from unleashing wildfire. Others urged caution, fearing the stigma of kinslaying and the potential backlash from houses still unsettled after the recent war. Rhaegar listened carefully, weighing each argument. Ultimately, a plan formed. They would confront Aerys in a controlled setting, away from any hidden caches of wildfire or loyalist guards. If the king yielded, he would be confined and declared unfit to rule, allowing Rhaegar to assume the throne. If he resisted, they would do whatever was necessary to prevent tragedy. Tywin pledged his soldiers to support Rhaegar. Jon Arryn promised the backing of the Vale, Ned Stark having already indicated that the North would stand behind Rhaegar rather than a mad king. On the appointed day, Rhaegar led a small group to the throne room. It was empty of the usual courtiers. Only a handful of loyal Kingsguard stood watch, along with Tywin's men at the doors. Aerys arrived under the assumption that this would be a private discussion of state matters. His suspicious glance darted around the room, lighting on Tywin's face with disdain, on Rhaegar with narrowed eyes. What is the meaning of this? Aerys demanded, his hands twitching at his sides. He wore a ragged black robe stained at the hem. There was no crown on his head, only a tangle of white hair. Rhaegar stepped forward, heart pounding. Father, you are unwell. For the sake of the realm, and for your own sake, you must step down as king. I will take your place. Now. Aerys's face twisted into a snarl, then abruptly he laughed, the sound echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Step down? You would commit treason, you ungrateful brat. I knew you coveted my throne. Your mother was the same, scheming. She died for her treachery. Rhaegar kept his voice steady. You speak madness. You have burned men alive, threatened to destroy the city with wildfire. I cannot stand aside while the realm suffers. Aerys shrieked, his words dissolving into incoherent rage. His spidery hands scrabbled at his belt, where a small dagger hung. But the Kingsguard did not move to defend him. Arthur Dayne stood still, sword sheathed, his expression resolute. Seeing the betrayal, Aerys turned wild eyes on them, spittle flying from his lips. He tried to back toward the throne, perhaps searching for a hidden cache of wildfire triggers, but Tywin's men closed ranks. It is over, Rhaegar said softly. The Mad King let out a final furious scream. He lunged at Rhaegar with the dagger. Rhaegar sidestepped easily, and Arthur Dayne caught the king's wrist, forcing him to drop the blade. Aerys fell to his knees, panting, eyes rolling with hysteria. Tywin gestured to his soldiers, who moved in to restrain the dethroned king. Rhaegar stood, trembling in the silence, every nerve taut. In that moment, a swirl of conflicting emotions tore at him, relief that he had prevented a larger disaster, guilt at betraying the father he had once idolized, fear of what the future held for a realm so scarred. But there was no turning back now. Aerys Targaryen was removed from power. The next day, a formal announcement was made. The king was declared unfit to rule, and Crown Prince Rhaegar Targaryen would ascend the Iron Throne as Rhaegar Y. The reaction across the Seven Kingdoms was swift and tumultuous. Some houses rejoiced, some fumed, but most recognized that under Aerys's madness, they had teetered on the brink of annihilation. Rhaegar's elevation promised stability, or so they hoped. The coronation took place in the same throne room that had so recently witnessed the fall of the Mad King. Aerys was conspicuously absent, locked away in the dungeons for his own safety. Rhaegar stood in black and red finery before the Iron Throne, the metal glinting under the torchlight. The High Septon recited the rites, placing the heavy crown of Aegon the Conqueror upon Rhaegar's silver hair. Lyanna stood beside him, holding baby Aemon in her arms, her gaze steady. The Targaryen banners with their three-headed dragon flapped overhead, echoing with the cheers of assembled lords. At last, Rhaegar seated himself on the jagged metal seat, the symbol of the realm's power. He felt each blade pressed into his back and shoulders, a physical reminder of the burdens that came with rule. From that throne, he looked out at the lords gathered, Tywin Lannister with a calculating gleam in his eye, Jon Arryn with calm approval, the royal guards in white cloaks, and distant watchers who had come to witness history. Lyanna was at his side, their son cooing softly, the child of ice and fire. Rhaegar's heart pounded with the enormity of it all. But a strange peace settled over him. He had walked through war, betrayal, prophecy, and at last emerged as king. He raised a hand for silence. The throne room stilled. "My lords and ladies," he began, voice carrying clear and steady, "we stand at the dawn of a new era. The realm has endured madness and war. We have lost fathers, brothers, sisters, and friends to the fires of conflict. Let us vow that no more lives will be burned in the crucible of hatred. Let us heal these wounds. As Rhaegar of House Targaryen, first of my name, I swear to uphold justice, to protect the weak, and to preserve the peace we have so dearly bought." Applause echoed off the vaulted ceiling, hesitant at first, then growing. Lords and ladies bowed their heads. The wind outside shifted, clearing away the rain, letting sunlight spill through the high windows. Rhaegar felt that light on his face, warm and renewing. He turned to regard Lyanna and their son, and his voice softened. "May the union of ice and fire bring strength to our kingdom. May the Seven smile upon us and guide our path. We have known too much pain. It is time to embrace hope." At that, the court erupted in cheers. Lyanna's gaze met his, a subtle, fierce pride in her eyes. Over the next weeks and months, King Rhaegar, I began the arduous task of restoring unity. He pardoned many of the rebels, including Robert Baratheon, whose wounds had healed enough for him to walk, though he still carried a bitter limp. Robert, subdued by his defeat and the knowledge that Lyanna had chosen another, elected to retire to the Stormlands, where he slowly found solace in hawking, feasting, and drinking. Ned Stark aided in reconciling northern lords. Jon Arryn guided the Vals' involvement in the new regime. Tywin Lannister took up the position of Hand of the King once more, though Rhaegar kept a careful eye on him, mindful of Tywin's ambitions. The realm calmed, though not without challenges. Dorne demanded assurances for Elia Martell's children, which Rhaegar granted, naming Rhaenys and Aegon as Princess and Prince of the Blood, though they came after his heir Aemon in succession. Some whispered that the future might see a rivalry between Aemon and his half-siblings. Yet for now, peace prevailed. In the months that followed, Lyanna rose to the role of queen consort with surprising grace. She learned the labyrinthine protocols of court, advised Rhaegar on northern matters, and intervened on behalf of the small folk whenever she could. Her outspoken nature garnered both admiration and alarm among the more conservative courtiers. But she was beloved by many, who saw her as a bridge between noble houses. Even Elia Martell, though still wounded by the circumstances, found a measure of respect for Lyanna's sincerity. King Rhaegar's reign began with rebuilding efforts, roads repaired, fields replanted, the scars of war tended. He supported the faith where prudent, but also sought to promote learning and scholarship, establishing new libraries. Rumors persisted that he scoured texts on ancient prophecies, seeking to prepare the realm for an unknown threat from the lands of always winter. But for the time being, life improved for the common folk. Taxes eased, and justice was more even-handed than under Aerys. Yet as the years passed, the realm never forgot how closely it had skirted oblivion. The memory of the Mad King's wildfire haunted many, and the presence of the dethroned monarch, locked away in the Red Keep's depths, served as a grim reminder of how fragile sanity could be. Still, the Seven Kingdoms pressed onward. Aemon Targaryen grew under the love of his mother and father, toddling through the gardens of the Red Keep, pursued by his laughing half-sister Rhaenys. Now and then, Rhaegar would take up his harp and sing soft lullabies to his son, reminiscent of the songs he once played in the halls of his youth. Lyanna would watch, a faint smile on her lips, remembering the gentle prince who had once crowned her the queen of love and beauty at Harrenhal. Some nights, when the moon was high and the corridors quiet, King Rhaegar and Queen Lyanna would walk together along the battlements, hand in hand. They gazed upon the city lights, listened to the distant waves of Blackwater Bay, and spoke of the future, of forging a kingdom where no child would be stolen to ignite a war, where prophecy and tradition could coexist with compassion and understanding. They had come so far, paying with blood and heartbreak, yet they stood together on the precipice of an uncharted tomorrow. In these reflective moments, Rhaegar felt the faint stirrings of destiny, the sense that all the choices he had made, good and ill, had led him to this vantage point. The great other beyond the wall, the secrets of dragons, the uncertain alliances among the great houses, these were trials yet to come. But he would face them as a king determined not to repeat the mistakes of his father. And at his side would be Lyanna Stark, who had braved the wrath of her kin and the scorn of half the realm to stand with him. Ice and fire, bound in the child they nurtured and the cause they shared. Thus the realm lived, for a time, in the calm after the storm. The scars of war would never fully vanish, but the Seven Kingdoms had found a king who wielded power with sincerity, and a queen who refused to be silent. In the annals of Westeros, songs would one day be written of the dragon prince who loved the wolf maid, of how their union healed the land torn by rebellion, and of the child who carried the legacy of both. The singers might well call it a tale of tragedy or triumph, depending on what followed in the tapestry of fate. But for now, under the rule of King Rhaegar I and Queen Lyanna Stark, the realm experienced a gentle reprieve, a lull in the endless cycle of chaos, a bright hush before the next wind of change blew across the land. And in that hush, those who looked to the horizon might have dared to hope that this time, the dawn would shine kinder on the Seven Kingdoms. Morning light spilled over the walls of the Red Keep, illuminating pale stone and rippling banners that bore the three-headed dragon of House Targaryen. Despite the hush of early day, the royal apartments stirred with quiet bustle. Servants padded through corridors, carrying trays of fresh bread and steaming tea. Maesters made their rounds to check on various courtiers, while gold cloaks stood at attention in polished armor. Beyond the windows, King's Landing stretched out like a shimmering tapestry of rooftops, the waters of Blackwater Bay reflecting the soft hues of dawn. In a spacious solar overlooking the city, King Rhaegar I Targaryen leaned forward at a carved wooden table, studying a collection of parchments spread before him. The faint lines at the corners of his mouth deepened with concentration. An occasional breeze rustled the loose strands of his silver hair, which draped the shoulders of a black and crimson robe embroidered with subtle dragon motifs. He tapped a finger on one letter in particular, reread it, then set it aside. A swirl of emotions crossed his face. Hope, frustration, determination. His counselors awaited his word. Sir Arthur Dayne stood to one side, silent as a statue, the hilt of dawn gleaming in the new light. Jon Arryn was present as well, robes meticulously pressed, calm eyes scanning the parchments in Rhaegar's wake. Tywin Lannister had arrived early, as was his habit, wearing the cool expression of a man who had learned every art of power. Varys lurked nearby, hands folded within the sleeves of his robe, a slight smile on his lips that betrayed no secrets. The others, secondary council members and scribes, hovered with quills at the ready. Rhaegar sighed quietly, gathering his thoughts before speaking. "You've all seen the ravens from the north." He lifted the most recent parchment, bearing Ned Stark's seal. Winterfell reports increasingly harsh conditions near the wall. The Night's Watch has requested additional supplies and more men. They claim that wildling raids are pressing harder than usual, but there's also mention of unsettling signs. Jon Arryn cleared his throat gently. Lord Eddard is not a man given to flights of fancy, If he expresses concern, we should heed him. Still, these references to ghosts in the woods or strange sightings may only be rumor. The wall has always been a realm of dire tales. Tywin's pale green eyes glimmered. Indeed, if the Night's Watch requires assistance, we should provide it. Yet, we must do so strategically. The Crown's funds are not infinite, and we have reconstruction efforts throughout the realm. A measured approach is best. Rhaegar nodded. We'll see that they receive grain, leathers, and additional recruits. Perhaps a dispatch of loyal knights to bolster morale. A small force, but large enough to show we take their concerns seriously. He glanced at Arthur Dane. I'd trust you, my friend, to recommend a capable knight to lead this detail. One who won't stir trouble among the Black Brothers. Arthur inclined his head. I'll see it done, Your Grace. The king set down the letter and rubbed his temples briefly. While the matter of the Night's Watch was not the kingdom's most urgent concern, it represented the shadow of the unknown, an unease that whispered of deeper threats beyond the horizon. Rhaegar found it ironic that after so many storms of rebellion and civil strife, it might be the quiet, otherworldly dangers in the far north that ultimately tested his rule. A slight knock on the doorframe drew everyone's attention. Elia Martell stepped inside, her dark hair braided back, a simple yet elegant gown of dusky rose clinging to her slender form. She carried a small tray in her hands, fruit slices, and a covered bowl. Your Grace, she said softly, dipping a respectful curtsy. Pardon the interruption, but I thought you might want to break your fast. Rhaegar offered a warm, if somewhat weary, smile. He still felt pangs of guilt whenever he looked upon Elia, remembering the heartbreak she had endured, but she remained gracious in her station. Thank you, Princess Elia, he said, inclining his head. I was too absorbed to think of breakfast. Then let me think of it for you, Elia replied. She set down the tray, bestowed a polite nod on the council, then withdrew. Rhaegar watched her go, deeply appreciative of her continued poise. In the early days of his reign, many had feared Elia might harbor resentment or scheme for her children, above all others. But if such thoughts existed, she never aired them. Instead, she busied herself ensuring Rhaenys and Aegon were raised with every courtesy, and she remained a quiet ally in the swirl of court politics. Her only request was always the same, that her children never be set aside or endangered by the new status quo. Rhaegar took a small bit of pear and turned his attention back to the council. Where were we? He asked. Yes, the north. We'll arrange for the supplies and a modest force under a suitable commander. John, please ensure the exchequer releases the necessary coin. Tywin, if you would coordinate with the city's quartermasters to gather the grain stores. Arthur, choose the knights. They nodded in agreement, making notes with crisp efficiency. But even as the meeting continued, Rhaegar felt a flutter of restlessness in his chest. He wanted to do more for the Night's Watch. He kept thinking of the lines in Ned Stark's letter, the sense of foreboding that bled through the page. A wise king would not ignore the North's pleas. Yet the realm was still tender from the war. Tywin was right about the coffers. The crown's finances, while recovering, were not limitless. Rhaegar could hardly dispatch half his army to man the wall, when the lords in the Stormlands and the Reach needed continued investment in roads, ports, and harvest subsidies. Still, he resolved he would not let the matter vanish into the black hole of bureaucracy. He made a mental note to meet with Ned personally when circumstances permitted. After the last of the council business concluded, the councillors dispersed. Tywin exited with his usual crisp strides, Varys drifting behind him like a shadow. Jon Arryn lingered only long enough to exchange a few polite words with Rhaegar, then departed. Arthur alone remained, pausing by the window. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, brightening the city's rooftops. Your Grace, Arthur said, voice quiet, there's something else on your mind. You've been ill at ease all week. Rhaegar pressed his lips into a thin line, considering how to word it. The realm is stable now, but it's still fragile. Tensions that ran so high do not vanish overnight. Robert Baratheon has remained quiet in the Stormlands, yet I keep hearing conflicting reports on his state of mind. Some say he's merely drinking himself into comfort. Others whisper he's forging alliances in secret. I don't know what to believe, Arthur. And then there's my father, locked in the dungeons. Then Derwine. Arthur's expression tightened. The memory of how they had deposed Eris was still fresh, a grim necessity that weighed on all of them. Eris remains under guard. He has few visitors, save the maesters who bring him meals. The last time I checked, he babbled about dragons and wildfire. Nothing coherent. Rhaegar nodded, feeling a pang he could not quite name. Eris had once been a father he admired in boyish innocence. Now, the man was a living testament to what unchecked madness could do, even to a lineage as storied as the Targaryens. Sometimes I wonder if there's a path to restore his mind, some combination of herbs and potions. Yet each day that passes, I see no improvement. He's a threat only if he's freed. I suppose I should be thankful he's contained. Arthur placed a hand on Rhaegar's shoulder. You spared him. More merciless kings would have had him executed. That was your choice, to grant him life, even if it must be lived behind bars. You made the decision you believed right. Rhaegar exhaled. Yes, he murmured. Right or not, it weighs on me. But let's see how the day unfolds. I hear my son stirring by now, and I promised Lyanna I'd join her in the nursery. Have you seen her this morning? No. Arthur shook his head. Not yet, Your Grace. Should I escort you? No, thank you. Take some rest for yourself. I know you were up late with the gold cloaks, reviewing the night patrols. Arthur gave a small, grateful nod. As you command. Rhaegar left the solar, weaving through the corridors of the Red Keep, exchanging courteous greetings with guards and courtiers. The castle was a place of labyrinthine halls and hidden nooks, thick with history both glorious and dark. Even after so many years, Rhaegar sometimes found corners he could not remember passing before. But the route to the royal nursery was well worn in his memory. It brought him past a courtyard where half a dozen noble children were practicing their letters, accompanied by Septus. The echoes of their lilting voices put a small smile on his face. He continued on, and at last he entered a chamber bathed in sunlight from wide-arched windows. Inside, Queen Lyanna sat in a cushioned chair, her dark hair cascading freely over her shoulders. Little Prince Aemon toddled around her feet, trying to reach for a carved wooden horse. He had grown surprisingly fast, sporting a mixture of silver and dark hair that was neither purely Targaryen nor purely Stark. When he saw his father, the boy let out a squeal of excitement and barreled forward on unsteady legs. Lyanna caught him just before he went sprawling, guiding him into Rhaegar's arms. There's my strong boy, Rhaegar murmured, lifting Aemon up. The child giggled and tugged at the dragon clasp on Rhaegar's robe. Lyanna watched them with a gentle smile, though her eyes held a hint of lingering fatigue. She was still adjusting to all the demands of queenship, not to mention motherhood. Yet a resilience burned in her, the same spark Rhaegar had recognized from the moment they first locked eyes at the tourney at Harrenhal. She rose, pressing a kiss to Rhaegar's cheek, before lowering her voice, so as not to startle Aemon. You're done with your council meeting? For now, he answered, letting Aemon clamber in his arms. Where's the wet nurse? She's just stepped out to prepare fresh milk. Aemon decided to practice his sprinting in her absence. Lyanna's mouth twitched in amusement. She looked up at her husband with curiosity. Any news from Ned? Rhaegar gave a nod, taking a seat on a cushioned bench, settling Aemon in his lap. The child reached for his mother's hand. Yes, we got new letters this morning, Rhaegar said. He's concerned about the wall, the winter storms, wildling attacks. I'll send some knights and supplies, but I only wish we could do more. The treasury can't sustain a massive deployment, not when we're still rebuilding roads and fortifications from the last war. Benda. Lyanna's expression turned thoughtful. Ned is never one to exaggerate. If he says the north is uneasy, then it's uneasy. But I know your burdens, Rhaegar. You're doing what you can. Rhaegar's gaze flickered to her, taking in the concern written plainly on her face. I might ask you as queen to handle some of the logistical planning. You've a talent for cutting through nonsense, if you're willing. Oh, of course. She leaned over, smoothing Aemon's hair. We'll see it done together. The lords in the north may not know me well, but if I can speak for both you and Ned, it might help them trust in the crown's intentions." Rhaegar felt a surge of gratitude. "Thank you, Lyanna," he said softly. "I've grown more and more aware of how vital your counsel is. You see things from another angle, an angle the southern lords can't comprehend." She looked away, a hint of a smile dancing at the corners of her lips. "You give me too much credit. I just want to be useful." They let the moment linger, the hush broken only by Aemon's happy babbling. It was in these small instances that the enormity of their journey crashed over Rhaegar. How they had defied an entire realm's expectations by uniting, how they had toppled a mad king, how they now forged a new era. The prophecy that once drove him, of the prince that was promised, still resonated in his thoughts. He wondered if Aemon was truly that promised savior, or if destiny had other plans. Regardless, the love he felt for his family was no mere prophecy. It was real, binding him more tightly than any crown. Yet outside the nursery's warm glow, the realm's machinations continued. Later that afternoon, Rhaegar met with courtiers from the Westerlands who had come to press for lower taxes on gold mines. Tywin Lannister accompanied them, though he listened more than he spoke. Rhaegar navigated the discussion with measured tact, mindful that House Lannister's support had been essential to securing peace. But beneath it all, he sensed Tywin's watchful gaze. The hand of the king missed nothing and excelled at reading advantage. Rhaegar could never quite guess how far Tywin's ambitions might reach, and whether they still extended beyond the throne toward some arrangement favoring House Lannister above all. For now, Tywin's loyalty seemed genuine, if only because it aligned with his long-term interests. When evening fell, Rhaegar joined Lyanna, Elia Martell, and the children for a modest supper in a private dining chamber. Over fresh fish from the Blackwater and roasted vegetables, Rhaegar asked after Rhaenys and Aegon, who were both doing well in their lessons. Rhaenys spoke excitedly of practicing the harp, determined to emulate her father's musical skill. Aegon, still young, showed a knack for memorizing stories about old Targaryen kings. Elia recounted these tales with subdued pride. Lyanna observed quietly, cutting small pieces of food for Aemon, who insisted on sitting near his half-siblings. The children's easy laughter filled the air, bridging the complexities between their mothers. It was a scene Rhaegar cherished. However unusual their family arrangement was in the eyes of the Seven Kingdoms, it worked, more or less. Soon after, the children were led away by their respective maids and nurses, leaving the three adults to speak more candidly. Elia sipped her mulled wine, then looked to Lyanna with a polite inclination of her head. "How are you finding the daily audiences? I know they can be overwhelming, especially for one who was raised in the north." Lyanna shrugged, though her cheeks colored slightly. "It's an adjustment. My father's halls were never so crowded, nor so full of schemers who hide poison behind flattery. But I'm learning." Rhaegar watched them both. In another world, they might have been adversaries, but time and necessity had pushed them toward a guarded camaraderie. Elia nodded slowly, setting her cup down. "If you ever need advice on who can be trusted, who's merely a flatterer, I can help. I've spent many years navigating these waters." A genuine smile touched Lyanna's lips. "Thank you. I may take you up on that. The Northerners are more direct. They'll scowl in your face if they dislike you. But here it's all smiles and hidden knives." Rhaegar cleared his throat gently. "Speaking of hidden knives, has Varys reported anything suspicious lately? He mentioned hearing talk of certain Stormlords exchanging secret letters." He cast a glance at Elia, knowing that some Stormlords were as loyal to her mother's side of the family in the Reach as they were to House Baratheon. Elia lifted her hands, palms open. "I have not heard anything concrete. Still, there are rumors that some lesser lords in the Stormlands are unhappy with your rule. They resent that Robert Baratheon was set aside so abruptly. But so far, there's no sign of outright rebellion." "Then Shawanda." Lyanna's gaze flicked to Rhaegar, concern evident. "We can't be complacent. Robert has every reason to hate us, and while he's alive, certain lords will always see him as a figurehead." Rhaegar nodded. He felt a familiar twist of regret. Once, When he had first learned of Robert's vow to marry Lyanna, he'd wondered if the stormy young lord might be a friend or rival. But fate had chosen a path drenched in blood. Robert had lost Lyanna, lost the war, lost nearly everything. When I allowed him to live, it was partly from mercy, partly from a wish to prevent martyrdom. If he's wise, he'll remain in the Stormlands, content with his feasts and hunts. But if he grows reckless, we may have to act. No one had a ready answer. They lapsed into silence, each pondering the threat that lingered like a gathering storm cloud. Finally, Elia stood. "I'll leave you both for the night. Sleep well." She offered them each a courteous nod, then exited the chamber, her gown trailing softly behind her. Lyanna exhaled as she watched Elia depart, and Rhaegar rose from his seat to take her hand. "Shall we walk in the gardens?" he asked. She nodded, letting him guide her through the Red Keep's quieter corridors, until they emerged into a courtyard lit by torches and the moon's pale glow. A gentle breeze carried the scent of night-blooming flowers. They strolled along a gravel path beneath twisted oaks and blossoming shrubs. Guards remained discreetly at a distance, affording the royal couple some semblance of privacy. For a time, they walked without speaking, content to let the hush of night envelop them. Lyanna was the first to break the silence. "Sometimes I wonder if we could have avoided all this. If I'd stayed in Winterfell. If you had never crowned me at Harrenhal. If Robert and I had wed despite my misgivings." Rhaegar squeezed her hand. "Do you regret it?" She was quiet for a moment, eyes on the flickering torches. "No, I don't regret our love or our son or the hope I feel for this new world. I regret the bloodshed, the pain, but not you nor what we share." His shoulders relaxed. "I too wish the realm had not paid so high a price, but I believe we can justify it by forging an era of peace. Perhaps even," he hesitated, recalling his obsession with prophecies, "we can prepare for threats the realm has never known. At least now we have a chance to do so united, not divided." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "You're right. As king, you have the power to shape the realm, but we can't rest on past victories. Too many want to see us fail." They paused by a stone bench near a fountain, the water glimmering in the moonlight. Rhaegar breathed in the cool night air. "I know. Tywin Lannister, for one, is always measuring me, deciding if I'm worthy of the power I hold. And others, like the Tyrells, still weigh whether they should align with me wholeheartedly or keep a distance. The Martells want further assurances for Elia's children. The Greyjoys brood on their isles, never fully content with southern rule. The Tullys remain loyal, but they chafe at certain taxes. The list is—" Lyanna's lips curled into a wry smile. "The burdens of kingship." "Indeed." He draped an arm around her, pulling her close. "Yet I'm grateful I don't bear them alone." They lingered a while longer before returning indoors. In the privacy of their chambers, they shared quiet moments with their son, who slept peacefully in his crib. Only then did Rhaegar yield to the press of exhaustion, letting himself drift into uneasy slumber. In the weeks that followed, the plan for reinforcing the Night's Watch took shape. Arthur Dayne selected a capable knight named Sir Jeremy Storm, an experienced warrior of bastard birth, loyal to the crown yet sympathetic to the common folk. Sir Jeremy assembled 50 knights and men-at-arms, accompanied by supply wagons bearing grain, salted meats, furs, and basic medicine. The column departed King's Landing to fanfare from the small folk, who saw it as a gracious act of the new king. Rhaegar wrote a personal letter to Lord Commander Corgyle of the Night's Watch, pledging more support if needed. Lyanna helped ensure that among the shipments were also seeds and tools, for she recalled how the North demanded self-reliance even within the Watch's territory. At the same time, the roads that had been torn up by the rebellion were being repaired by Crown-funded teams. Masons in the Crownlands worked tirelessly under the supervision of engineers hired from Pentos. Rhaegar believed that improved infrastructure would knit the Seven Kingdoms together more effectively than any vow of fealty. His father had neglected such mundane tasks, focusing instead on paranoid extravagances. Rhaegar intended a different legacy. While these efforts proceeded, Tywin Lannister quietly proposed a grand tourney to celebrate the relative peace and to honor King Rhaegar's ascension. He suggested that lords from across Westeros be invited, that the festivities be held at lannisport, a chance for the realm to gather, to see your rule in a more festive light, Tywin explained in council. It would also quell lingering discontent if we demonstrated the crown's confidence and unity. Rhaegar mulled the idea. Tourneys were costly, and not every lord would appreciate lavish spending when the realm was still healing. On the other hand, he remembered how once, at Harrenhal, a tourney had sparked the chain of events that changed his life forever. Could a new tourney help solidify the bonds he was trying to forge? After careful deliberation, he decided to allow it, but with strict guidelines to limit excess. Tywin readily agreed, his face an unreadable mask. Invitations went out, carried by swift riders to every corner of the 7 kingdoms. Lannisport bustled with preparations. Merchants thronged the streets, setting up stalls to cater to the influx of visitors. Knights and squires arrived in droves, eager to display their prowess or witness the spectacle. For many, it would be the first major tourney under King Rhaegar's reign, a chance to see if the realm truly turned a new page. Elia Martell chose to remain in King's Landing, somewhat wary of large public gatherings. She preferred to keep Rhaenys and Aegon in a calmer environment. Lyanna, however, decided to travel with Rhaegar, eager to see more of the realm and to observe the lords outside the capital. They departed on a crisp morning, accompanied by a sizable escort of Kingsguard, gold cloaks, and various courtiers. Aemon traveled with them, in a covered litter under the care of nursemaids, though Lyanna insisted on riding alongside him whenever the road was smooth enough. The journey to Lannisport took them across fertile fields and rolling hills. Small folk lined the roads to catch glimpses of the royal retinue. Rhaegar halted at several towns, taking the time to hear grievances. He distributed coin to help rebuild a burned mill here, offered a personal blessing for a newly raised sept there. It was a far cry from Aerys's days, when the common folk trembled at any royal approach. Gradually, Rhaegar sensed a cautious optimism forming among the people. They reached Lannisport at last. The city sparkled with wealth, its harbor crowded with merchant ships. On the horizon loomed Casterly Rock, the ancestral seat of House Lannister, a colossal fortress carved from the rock itself. Along the outskirts of the city, lists had been erected for the tourney. Colorful banners fluttered in the wind. Rows of bleachers accommodated onlookers. Already, the distant sounds of hammering and the smell of hot-spiced wine filled the air. Tywin Lannister greeted them at the gates with formal courtesy, bowing as Rhaegar dismounted. The king surveyed the elaborate decorations and raised an eyebrow. "I ask for moderation," he said softly, noticing the sheer number of canopies and stands. Tywin's thin lips curved in a half-smile. "These arrangements are modest by Lannisport standards, Your Grace. The city is enthusiastic." "No." Rhaegar left it at that, and beckoned Lyanna to dismount. She did so gracefully, eyeing the scene with a mix of awe and wariness. "It's quite a spectacle," she murmured. "Makes Harrenhal seem almost humble." They moved inside, escorted to luxurious quarters in a grand manner near the lists. Servants bustled about, ensuring every comfort was provided. Lyanna, used to Winterfell's austere sensibilities, looked slightly overwhelmed, but she kept her composure. Aemon was brought to a separate chamber, overseen by nursemaids. Rhaegar and Lyanna took a moment to settle before they were summoned to a formal reception. Dressed in their finery, he in a black doublet with the 3-headed dragon embroidered in red thread, she in a gown of silver-gray silk, they entered a hall where lords and ladies vied for their attention. Lord Mace Tyrell was present, effusive in his greetings, wearing a heavy green robe that strained at the seams. Various bannermen of the Reach surrounded him, bowing and paying compliments to Lyanna's beauty, to Rhaegar's wisdom. Lord Redwine offered vintage Arbor gold wine, pouring it into goblets with a flourish. The sight of so many southwestern lords in one place reminded Rhaegar how crucial it was to maintain their favor. Without the breadbasket of the Reach, the crown's hold on the realm would be tenuous. From the Westerlands, many minor lords had come. They clustered around Tywin, praising the generosity of House Lannister in hosting the event. Amid the throng, Rhaegar spotted a tall, barrel-chested man with graying hair and a thick mustache. Lord Roland Crakehall. He had a reputation as an old-school knight of fearsome prowess. Another was Lord Lefford, slender and sharp-eyed, a noted keeper of accounts. They bowed to Rhaegar, offering polite remarks. The atmosphere brimmed with tension cloaked by forced pleasantry. As the evening wore on, Rhaegar found himself cornered by Lord Swift, who loudly proclaimed the Lannisters' unmatched devotion to the crown. While Rhaegar responded with the expected courtesies, he caught glimpses of Tywin from across the room, wearing that same inscrutable half-smile. The dynamic felt like a carefully choreographed dance. Every gesture from the Westerland's courtiers was designed to remind the king of their wealth, their power, their generosity, and perhaps to subtly underscore that the realm's prosperity hinged on Lannister goodwill. Meanwhile, Lyanna navigated her own wave of introductions. Ladies from the Westerlands and the Reach fluttered around her, some with genuine curiosity, others simply eager to see this northern woman who had captured a dragon prince. She listened politely, occasionally glancing over to see where Rhaegar was. The evening felt endless, a swirl of scents and voices that made her long for Winterfell's simple hearth. Still, she conducted herself with dignity, determined to do her part in fostering unity. When at last they retired to their chambers, the night was well advanced. Rhaegar collapsed into a chair, exhaling. Lyanna quietly removed her jewelry, setting each piece on a small table. "They're so different from the northern lords," she said. "In the north, a man's word is enough. Here, everything is couched in courtesies and half-truths." He nodded, massaging his temples. "It can be exhausting. But it's the price we pay for holding the throne. We can't rule alone." Then she came to stand behind him, resting her hands on his shoulders. "I know," she said gently. "You're doing what must be done." The next morning dawned bright, the sky a brilliant blue. Trumpets rang out from the tourney grounds, heralding the first day of events. Despite his reservations, Rhaegar felt a sliver of excitement as he dressed in lighter garments suited for the warm Westerland's climate. Lyanna wore a gown of cool white linen, her dark hair braided back simply. They arrived at the lists to a roar of applause from the assembled crowds. The royal box was shaded by a canopy bearing the Targaryen sigil. Tywin Lannister and several highborn guests sat in an adjacent box, the lions of House Lannister emblazoned on crimson banners. Overhead, gulls wheeled, drawn by the smell of roasted meats and spilled ale. The jousting field spread out below, the tilt barrier running down its center. Knights paraded in splendid armor, shining in the morning sun. Squires bustled, adjusting straps and buckles, presenting crests to the roaring spectators. Rhaegar couldn't help recalling that fateful tourney at Harrenhal. How he had worn black armor and crowned Lyanna with the winter roses. So much had changed since then. Yet in the heart of a tourney, certain timeless traditions held: bravery, skill, the clash of lances. As the jousts began, the king and queen watched from their seats, smiling politely whenever a lance shattered or a rider unhorsed his opponent. The crowd cheered for the favorites. Sir Barristan Selmy, who had traveled here from King's Landing, still as graceful and chivalrous as ever. Lord Crakehall, who showed surprising agility for a man his age, and a mysterious knight in dark blue armor, who refused to lift his visor. The latter drew murmurs, as no one recognized his sigil, a white crescent moon on black. Between rounds, pages brought trays of fresh fruit, mead, and iced water. Lyanna sipped sparingly, her eyes scanning the stands for any sign of trouble. Rhaegar, too, periodically glanced at the crowd. He knew that if an assassin wanted to strike, a public event was often the perfect stage. But nothing seemed amiss aside from the usual hustle of money, changing hands in bets. By midday, the sun blazed overhead, and the crowd sought shade under awnings. The heralds announced a break. During this lull, Tywin Lannister appeared in the royal box, bowing deeply. "Your Grace," he said with a formal smile. "An impressive display, no? I must say lannisport always brings out fine talent." Rhaegar managed a polite nod. "Indeed, Lord Tywin. My compliments to your city's hospitality." Mendero. Tywin's gaze flicked briefly to Lyanna, then back to Rhaegar. "Might I request a brief word in private, Your Grace? There is a matter of some significance." Lyanna exchanged a look with Rhaegar, reading the tension in Tywin's tone. Rhaegar gestured for her to remain in the box. Then he followed Tywin to a nearby tent that housed refreshments, the interior cooled by servants fanning the air. Once inside, Tywin waved the servants away, leaving just the two of them. "What is this about?" Rhaegar asked quietly, bracing himself. Tywin's expression remained controlled, his hands folded behind his back. "There have been murmurings from the Stormlands," he began. "I've received word that certain lords are not simply sulking in solitude. They've begun forging alliances with minor reach lords, dissatisfied second sons, opportunists. They cling to the idea that Robert Baratheon is the rightful king." Rhaegar's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "You have proof?" Tywin drew out a small scroll, sealed with no sigil. "A letter from one of my informants, a merchant who frequents both Storm's End and Tumbleton. He suggests that Robert has been meeting secretly with these malcontents. Plans are in motion, though their scale is unclear." Menenda sighed. A prickle of anger flared in Rhaegar's chest. "Robert was defeated. I showed mercy. Now he breaks the peace." Tywin gave a small shrug. "Men like Robert thrive on conflict. He lost his betrothed, lost his war, lost his standing. To him, the notion of quietly accepting your reign is anathema. My fear is that if these lords accumulate enough resources, we may see the spark of rebellion once more." Rhaegar inhaled a slow breath. "I won't let the realm plunge into another war. If Robert tries to rally arms, I'll stop him before he can cause carnage. But we must be certain. I won't execute a man on mere hearsay." Tywin inclined his head. "Of course not, Your Grace. My suggestion is that we send a discreet emissary to Storm's End, someone Robert might listen to. Someone he'll realize can speak with your full authority. Offer him terms to ensure his continued loyalty, or at least his neutrality. If he refuses to meet, that alone tells us something." Rhaegar mulled over the idea. Who could we send that he'd take seriously, yet not provoke him? A thin smile crossed Tywin's lips. "Perhaps your wife's brother. Eddard Stark is well known to Robert. They were once close, from what I understand, raised together by Jon Arryn. If anyone can speak sense to Robert, it might be Eddard." Rhaegar considered this carefully. Ned Stark had indicated a willingness to help maintain the peace, but sending him south again, so soon after he'd returned home, might be a burden. Still, the logic was sound. Robert would be less likely to react violently to Ned than to a nameless messenger from the crown. "I'll write to Ned," Rhaegar decided at last. "I'll explain the situation and ask him to go to Storm's End. If Robert refuses a meeting with Ned, then we know he's truly gone beyond reason." Tywin dipped his head in agreement. "Wise, Your Grace. In the meantime, enjoy the tourney. I'll continue listening for any fresh rumors." With that, the Lord of Casterly Rock withdrew, leaving Rhaegar alone in the cool tent. He stared at the scroll in his hands, reading the words again, though they were few. Robert Baratheon, conspiring. After everything that had happened, the thought made Rhaegar's stomach churn. He recalled the savage duel at the Trident, the image of Robert lying in the shallows, blood staining the water. Rhaegar had let him live. Was that a mercy that might come back to haunt the realm? He exited the tent, returning to the stands with a subdued expression. Lyanna sensed his mood immediately. "What is it?" she asked softly, leaning closer so no one else would overhear. "I'll tell you later," he replied, not wanting to cast a pall over the festivities. "For now, let's watch the jousts." The afternoon session began with fanfare. Riders thundered down the lists, lances lowered, the crowd cheering at each impact. Sir Barristan unseated a popular hedge knight with elegant precision. Lord Crakehall shattered 2 lances against a younger challenger, but eventually lost a tilt. The mysterious knight in blue carried on, defeating opponent after opponent without revealing his face. Whispers flew about his identity. Some suggested it was a lord's baseborn son, others a Dornish knight disguised to avoid inciting tension with the Lannisters. The speculation only fueled the crowd's excitement. When the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows over the field, the heralds declared the end of the day's matches. That evening, a lavish feast awaited in a grand tent, strung with lanterns. Servants ushered the king and queen to places of honor at a raised table, where they sat alongside Tywin Lannister and other high-born guests. Mace Tyrell and Lord Crakehall regaled them with stories of hunts and battles. Roasted boar, spiced potatoes, and honeyed cakes circulated. Musicians played lively tunes, some of which spurred the younger lords to dance. Rhaegar forced himself to partake in the conversation, but his mind strayed to Robert Baratheon. Lyanna noticed his distraction, occasionally touching his arm in a show of quiet support. She, too, seemed to sense the undercurrents of tension that ran beneath the revelry. At one point, she looked across the tent and saw a group of knights from the Stormlands, stiff in posture, politely sipping their wine but seldom joining in the laughter. It was an omen of the potential discord to come. The next morning, the final day of the jousts began. Anticipation crackled in the air. The bracket had narrowed to a handful of top contenders: Ser Barristan, Lord Crakehall, two lesser-known but promising Reach Knights, and the enigmatic Blue Knight. The crowd roared as each pair rode at each other with thunderous hooves. By midday, only Ser Barristan and the Blue Knight remained, undefeated. They took the field for a tense final tilt, lances glinting in the sun, their armor ablaze with reflected light. The first pass ended in a clash of shields. Both riders maintained their seats, though the crowd gasped at the force of impact. The second pass. Ser Barristan's lance splintered against the Blue Knight's shield, while the Blue Knight's own lance glanced off Barristan's armor. Dust rose from the field. Trumpets signaled the third and final pass. The hush was nearly absolute. Rhaegar leaned forward, recalling how he himself once jousted in secret at Harrenhal, playing at anonymity. Now he was on the other side, watching the unknown contender approach. With a final blare of horns, the two knights charged. Barristan's aim was impeccable, the tip of his lance angled to strike the Blue Knight's shoulder. But at the last instant, the Blue Knight twisted, hooking Barristan's lance aside with the edge of his shield. The mysterious knight's own lance caught Barristan's breastplate with shocking precision, unseating him in a flourish of dust. The crowd erupted. Barristan landed on his back, raising an arm to indicate he was not seriously hurt. The victor circled back, saluting the fallen knight. Applause thundered from the stands. Rhaegar rose, clapping in admiration. "Well struck," he murmured. Beside him, Lyanna wore an intrigued smile. The Blue Knight reined in near the royal box, raising his visor at last. A collective gasp spread through the spectators. The knight was a woman, tall, strong-boned, with a pale, freckled face and coppery hair bound in a thick braid. She looked to be no more than 20. Shock turned to wild cheers at the revelation. It was not unheard of for a woman to don armor, but rarely did one triumph at such a grand event. Rhaegar stepped forward, beckoning her closer. "Your name, sir, or my lady," he called with warmth in his voice. She swept off her helmet entirely and bowed from the saddle. "My name is Brienne of Tarth, your grace," she said in a clear voice. "They call my home the Sapphire Isle. I beg your pardon for my deception, but I wish to prove myself without preconception." Rhaegar turned to Lyanna, seeing the excitement in her eyes. Lyanna's grin widened. No doubt she admired the audacity. He looked back at Brienne. "You have proven yourself most admirably, my lady. Tarth has every reason to be proud. Come, receive your accolades." Brienne dismounted, struggling a bit with her saddle's strap. One of the heralds approached, offering her the victor's wreath. A simple laurel, as Rhaegar had decreed that the tourney remain less ostentatious. Still, Brienne bowed to accept it, her face tinged pink. The applause raged on, though a few muttered discontent from those who found the notion of a woman beating famed knights embarrassing. Rhaegar ignored them, heartened by the display of skill and courage. When the ceremony concluded, Rhaegar descended from the royal box with Lyanna on his arm. Ser Barristan stood nearby, holding his dented helm. Rhaegar clapped him gently on the shoulder. "Ser Barristan, You fought well." He nodded, chuckling ruefully. "She outmaneuvered me. I'm only glad it was a fair contest." Besunshao. Brienne bowed again to them all. Speechless, uncertain how to handle the attention. Lyanna moved closer, offering an encouraging smile. "Well done, my lady. That was a fine display of prowess." "Thank you, my queen," Brienne replied. "I've admired you since I heard tales of how you stood your ground for your own choices." Lyanna's cheeks warmed at the compliment, and Rhaegar gave Brienne a parting nod. "If you ever seek a place in the royal guard, let it be known I'd not turn away such skill." A flicker of surprise lit Brienne's eyes. She bowed once more, and then the crowd swept her away, knights and lords eager to congratulate, or gawk at, this unexpected victor. As the day closed, Rhaegar found himself in far better spirits than he had anticipated, bolstered by the sense that new possibilities might bloom in a realm that was learning, however slowly, to shed some of its old prejudices. Yet the conversation with Tywin remained in the back of his mind. Robert Baratheon. Conspiracy. Restless lords. He resolved to dispatch a raven to Winterfell that very night, urging Ned Stark to come south. They returned to King's Landing in the following days, accompanied by a smaller guard, leaving most lords to linger in Lannisport for merriment, or to depart at their leisure. The road back was quieter, and the novelty of the journey had faded. Lyanna seemed subdued. Rhaegar noticed her lost in thought more often, glancing southward, as though she sensed a gathering threat. He himself was uneasy. Once they were home in the Red Keep, the routine of governance engulfed them again. Missives from various lords awaited. There were pleas for justice, for decrees on property disputes, for clarifications on new trade tariffs. Rhaegar, assisted by Tywin and Jon Arryn, worked through the pile. Meanwhile, Lyanna took on some of the oversight for supply shipments bound for the Wall. Every so often Rhaegar saw her gazing out of a window, as if longing for the colder air of the north, for Winterfell's honest chill. He understood. The heat of King's Landing, and the undercurrent of intrigue, could be stifling. At last a raven arrived from Winterfell. Ned Stark agreed to the mission. He would ride south to parley with Robert in the Stormlands, hoping to confirm or refute the rumors of rebellion. Rhaegar felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. If Robert was indeed assembling a coalition, Ned might be placing himself in danger. Yet Ned was one of the few men Robert might still respect. Rhaegar penned a personal letter for Ned to deliver, reaffirming that Robert remained a lord under the crown's protection, free to manage his own domain if he stayed loyal. The subtext was clear: rebel again, and the crown would have no choice but to respond. Time in the capital settled into a tense rhythm. The small council convened more often, the topic of Robert never far from their minds. Lyanna continued her quiet diligence, meeting with courtiers, ensuring that the shipments to the north remained on schedule, even as the nights grew longer. It was said that winter crept closer, though the realm had not yet felt its full force. And in the far corners of the city, rumors persisted of a hidden threat in the dungeons. Ares, the Mad King, still alive, still ranting about fire. Occasionally, a guard reported that the old man banged on the walls, howling at unseen foes. Rhaegar tried not to think too long on it. Some nights he dreamed of wildfire, dreamed of the city in flames as Ares laughed. He would wake drenched in sweat, Lyanna comforting him. She never pressed him for details. She knew the horrors well enough. As the moon waxed toward full, Ned Stark arrived in King's Landing, a grim cast to his features. He stayed only a single night, conferring briefly with Rhaegar to finalize instructions. Lyanna embraced her brother warmly, asking after the rest of the Starks. He spoke of Winterfell, of the younger siblings growing, of the cold winds that rattled the shutters. Then, the next morning, Ned and his small retinue set out for the Stormlands, the royal letter carried in his satchel. In the days that followed, Rhaegar distracted himself with the details of daily governance. One morning, he visited the training yard, where young squires were put through their paces by experienced armsmasters. High above, in a walkway along the inner wall, Lyanna looked on while holding Aemon's hand. The little prince seemed fascinated by the clang of steel. Rhaegar occasionally shot them a grin, recalling how once he had studied the art of the sword, under the watchful eye of master knights. But he had always gravitated more toward books and the harp. A warrior king who preferred music. Some found that amusing, but he would not apologize for it. He was about to demonstrate a sword form to one of the squires when the distant call of horns reached them. A messenger raced into the yard, breathless, scanning for the king. Rhaegar handed the wooden practice sword to the squire and strode forward. The messenger, face flushed, bowed low. "Your Grace, word from the Stormlands. Lord Eddard was refused entry at Storm's End. Robert Baratheon would not see him." A hush fell over the training yard. Even the squires ceased their drills. Rhaegar's heart sank. "Did Lord Stark return safely?" "Yes, Your Grace," said the messenger. "He waits without, seeking an audience. He bears ill news." Rhaegar exchanged a glance with Lyanna, who hovered above the yard, her knuckles white where she gripped the stone parapet. Aemon clung to her skirts, sensing tension. Rhaegar forced himself to remain calm. "Bring Lord Stark to the throne room. I will hear his report at once." Within the hour, the throne room filled with courtiers, guards, and curious onlookers. Rhaegar sat upon the iron throne in formal attire, the weight of the ancient seat pressing against his back. Lyanna stood nearby, her expression taut with worry. Arthur Dayne and other Kingsguard members flanked them. When Ned Stark entered, his dusty cloak bore the marks of hard travel. He knelt, then rose to address the king. "Robert refused me at the gates, Your Grace," Ned said, voice echoing in the vaulted hall. "His castellan claimed Robert was indisposed, but I heard men on the ramparts muttering about war and justice. I made inquiries in the nearby towns. Several Stormland lords are gathering men. They speak in hushed tones of finishing what they started before the trident. I fear Robert intends to rise against you again." Murmurs surged among the courtiers. Lyanna's face blanched, her eyes dark with sorrow and anger. Rhaegar steeled himself. He had tried reason, tried mercy. "Lord Stark," he said calmly, "thank you for your efforts. Your honesty does you credit." Ned lowered his eyes. "I am sorry, Your Grace. I had hoped to persuade him. But Robert's heart is hardened. He believes you stole Lyanna from him, that the realm suffers under Targaryen rule as before. His men speak of him as the avenger of some twisted notion of justice." Rhaegar felt a tremor in his limbs. He rose from the throne, the hall falling silent. "I offered him peace," he said quietly. "I let him live. Yet he spurns us, readies for more bloodshed. Very well. I will not allow thousands to die again because of Robert's pride. We must act." "Mensowen sense." Ned bowed his head. "What would you have me do?" Rhaegar glanced toward Lyanna. The pain in her eyes mirrored his own. She had once cared for Robert as a friend. Perhaps, under different circumstances, they might have found happiness together. That path had long since vanished. "Return to Winterfell," Rhaegar said. "Prepare your bannermen to defend the north should Robert's rebellion spread. But let us hope it does not come to that. For now, gather your strength. The crown will handle this matter." Then, Ned looked relieved to depart from the South's intrigue, though guilt flickered across his face. "As you command, Your Grace." After Ned left, Rhaegar convened his small council. Tywin Lannister listened intently, lips pressed tight. Jon Arryn, who had once fostered both Ned and Robert, appeared grave, as though mourning the men they had once been. Varys offered quiet suggestions about gathering information. The consensus was grim. Robert would not relent, and he would likely strike alliances with other malcontents. Rhaegar gave the order to begin mustering loyal forces, but quietly, so as not to spark panic. That night, alone with Lyanna, Rhaegar let his composure crack. "I tried so hard," he murmured, pacing near a window. "If I'd slain Robert at the trident, we might have avoided this." Lyanna pressed a hand to her face, torn between sorrow and frustration. "You're not a monster, Rhaegar. You did what you thought was right. I only wish Robert would see reason. But he won't." Rhaegar moved closer, taking her hands gently. "We'll stop him without letting the realm bleed again. I swear it." "Then shall." She nodded, though tears glistened at the corners of her eyes. "For Aemon's sake, for all our children's sake." In the days that followed, ravens flew in haste, carrying messages to the crown's loyal lords. Barristan Selmy and Arthur Dane oversaw martial preparations in the Red Keep, drilling the gold cloaks and assembling a contingent of knights to be ready at a moment's notice. Ships were outfitted in the royal fleet to patrol the Blackwater Bay, ensuring no rebel force could land near the capital undetected. Diplomats scurried to the Reach and the Riverlands, requesting reaffirmations of loyalty should conflict arise. Most lords obliged, weary of war. But rumors suggested a handful of Stormland lords had already pledged men to Robert in secret. Amid the mounting tension, Rhaegar wrestled with an urgent question: how to stop Robert without igniting a catastrophic war? They could try sending a small force to Storm's End, but it was a fortress well known for withstanding sieges. If Robert had enough support, any direct assault might turn into a protracted conflict. Another possibility was to cut off Robert's supply lines, starve him out without open battle. Yet even that tactic risked rebellious sparks flaring across the realm. At a council meeting, Tywin Lannister put forward a bold suggestion: arrest any Stormland lord suspected of treason, using the suspicion alone as cause. Rhaegar hesitated, recalling how tyranny could breed further unrest. He did not want to follow his father's footsteps, arresting men on rumor. Yet each day of indecision allowed Robert to bolster his position. While these debates raged, the nights grew longer, the air sharper. Word came from the wall that more wildlings pressed against its boundaries, though the knights Rhaegar had sent helped maintain order. Rhaegar felt torn between the potential threat in the far north and the immediate threat from the Stormlands. The realm was vast, and he could not be everywhere at once. Then, as though the situation were not complicated enough, a new raven arrived from Pike in the Iron Islands. Balon Greyjoy wrote of taking what is owed if the crown was too distracted to guard its coasts. Rhaegar suspected it was a veiled threat. The Ironborn might raid the western shorelines or the Reach if given an opening. Tywin Lannister frowned deeply at the mention of Balon Greyjoy, recalling how the man had tested the realm's might in the past. Yet one night, as Rhaegar trudged through the castle halls after another late council session, he heard the distant sounds of a harp. Familiar chords, played softly from behind a half-open door. Drawn by the melody, he followed the notes into a small gallery. There sat Lyanna, alone, save for a single candle. She cradled Rhaegar's own silver-stringed harp, plucking the strings with hesitant fingers. When she noticed him, she paused, blush rising in her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she whispered, as though caught in a trespass. "I couldn't sleep. I remember how you used to play for me. I wanted to hear those notes again." He smiled gently. "You've no need to apologize. Play on." She tried a short melody, stumbling slightly. He moved behind her, guiding her hands with his own, showing her the correct positions for each chord. The music came haltingly at first, then found its rhythm. A warm hush settled over them. In the swirl of war and conspiracy, that moment felt like a reprieve, a reminder of the simple bond that had started them on this path. She finished the piece with a trembling chord, then let out a soft exhalation. "Thank you," she murmured. "I needed that." He leaned forward, pressing a kiss to her hair. "So did I." They stayed like that for a time, letting the echoes linger in the small gallery. Outside, the wind rustled the flags along the ramparts, a distant promise of turmoil. But in that stolen instant, they were only a man and a woman in love, drawn together by fate. The next day, all illusions of calm were shattered. A raven arrived from a scouting party dispatched near the Stormlands border. They had encountered a band of armed men wearing the crowned stag of Baratheon, led by Lord Fell, openly harassing crown-aligned peasants. Worse, the messenger reported that hundreds more men were gathering in a valley south of Bronzegate, flying Robert's banner. The rebellion had begun. Rhaegar closed his eyes upon reading the words, feeling history repeat itself. He summoned the small council at once. "We have no choice," Rhaegar said with lead in his voice. "Robert has forced our hand. I will raise the royal host and march on him before he can gather more allies. If we let him consolidate, we risk a full-scale war." Tywin Lannister leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Bold action. Good. I will call the Westerland's banners. The Tyrells will likely assist, as they hold no love for Robert. We can trap him between the Crown's host and the Reachmen. Rhaegar shook his head. I'd prefer not to rely on Tyrell forces immediately. Their numbers are large, and if they cross into the Stormlands, the fighting could spread across half the continent. We'll see if the threat of a second front deters Robert's allies. Meanwhile, the royal army will do the brunt of the initial push. No. John Arryn spoke up. Your Grace, I remember the last rebellion. Robert is a formidable commander and warrior. We must not underestimate him. He commands the loyalty of men who still see him as a hero. If we meet him in open battle, the cost could be high. Rhaegar winced, recalling the deadly dance on the trident. I'll do everything I can to avoid a pitched battle. Perhaps if we move quickly, we can corner Robert or force him to surrender. He cannot match the Crown's entire army. And if the rumors are true, he does not have the resources for a prolonged campaign. They agreed on a plan. The next morning, horns rang out in King's Landing. Messengers galloped to the Crownland's lords, summoning them to muster at Rosby. Rhaegar donned his armor, an updated version of the one he had worn at the Trident, minus the rubies that had once adorned it. He bid farewell to Lyanna, who stood in the courtyard, clad in a practical riding dress. She insisted on accompanying him at least partway, to help oversee supplies, and to keep an eye on the lords whose loyalty might waver. They set forth at dawn, leading a column of knights, men-at-arms, and supply wagons. Flags bearing the three-headed dragon fluttered above, the beat of hooves echoing on the roads. Townsfolk turned out to watch, some in silent dread, others in nervous anticipation. So soon after the last war, they were thrust again into the threat of conflict. Rumors whispered that the Targaryens and Baratheons were locked in an endless dance of fate. After a day's ride, they reached Rosby, where local lords had begun to gather. Ser Barristan Selmy, Arthur Dane, and other Kingsguard took charge of organizing the knights. Maesters oversaw the distribution of rations. Lyanna moved among the tents, speaking with quartermasters, her northern directness cutting through their bureaucracy. The men spoke with admiration of the queen, who seemed unafraid to dirty her hands in the camp. Rhaegar convened a war council in Lord Rosby's hall, a modest structure of timber and stone. Maps were spread on a long table, showing the roads leading into the Stormlands. Scouts indicated that Robert's main force congregated near Summerhall, the ruins that once belonged to House Targaryen. The irony did not escape Rhaegar. Summerhall was the site of tragedy in his family's history, a place haunted by the memory of lost dragons. Now it served as a rallying point for a new rebellion. If we move swiftly down the Rose Road, we can intercept them before they reach the safety of Storm's End, Barristan said, pointing to the map. But we risk pushing too far too fast. Tywin Lannister, who had joined them with a contingent of his own men, arched an eyebrow. I disagree. Speed is of the essence. We must not let them fortify Summerhall. If we do, they'll entrench and drag this out. A short war is a cheaper war. Rhaegar weighed both perspectives. Barristan Arthur, gather the scouts. I want the best possible intelligence on Robert's troop numbers. Tywin, begin preparing the men to march at first light. We'll see if we can isolate Robert's host from any reinforcements. I have no desire for a drawn-out campaign. The realm needs peace. Benderu. As the council broke up, Rhaegar exchanged a tense glance with Lyanna, who had quietly listened. She placed a hand on his forearm. Be careful, she whispered. Robert fights like a man possessed when cornered. He covered her hand with his. I won't make the same mistake twice. I'll try to capture him if I can, to end this quickly. That night, the encampment bustled with final preparations. Smiths hammered at horseshoes. Soldiers sharpened swords by torchlight. The sky overhead was clear but cold, dotted with stars. Rhaegar walked among the men, offering words of encouragement. He noticed that many who had fought at the Trident wore expressions of deep unease, as though old ghosts had returned to haunt them. Some recognized the futility of fighting the same foe again, yet duty bound them to the crown. Before retiring, Rhaegar found Lyanna by the supply wagons, reviewing the next day's allotments of food and fodder. She looked up, saw him, and set aside the ledger. "I'm almost finished," she said softly. He nodded and gestured for her to follow him to a quieter corner of the camp, near a copse of trees. They stood beneath the branches, listening to the muffled clamor. Torchlight flickered around them, painting shifting shadows on the ground. He took both her hands, studying her face. "Tomorrow, we march for war." She swallowed hard. "Yes. I wish I could ride with you." "You could," he admitted, pressing his forehead to hers. "But I'd rather you stay behind the lines, ensuring the supply lines remain secure. If we meet Robert's forces, I'd have you safe." "Ben?" She sighed, understanding. "All right. But promise me you'll try to end this quickly. I can't bear the thought of more blood spilled for my sake." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "It's not just for your sake. It's for the realm. Robert will tear the kingdom apart if unchecked. I won't let him." His voice grew quieter. "I love you." She reached up, cupping his cheek. "I love you too," she whispered. They embraced, holding on to each other for a long moment, as though bracing themselves against the storm that threatened to sweep away all they had built. At first light, the royal host moved out. Drums and horns sounded a low, steady beat that rattled in men's chests. Thousands of boots trod the road, dust rising in their wake. Wagons groaned, carrying supplies and weapons. Rhaegar rode at the forefront, resplendent in black armor with a red dragon sigil etched into the breastplate. Arthur Dayne rode beside him, and behind them, a swath of knights in steel and leather. Somewhere further back, Tywin Lannister led his own battalions, bright lion banners fluttering in the wind. For 3 days, they advanced at a measured pace, pausing only to let scouts range ahead. Reports came in that Robert had indeed set up near Summerhall. The rebel numbers were not vast, perhaps a few thousand, but more than enough to cause havoc, if given time to grow. Rhaegar pressed forward, ignoring the uneasy stares of villagers who lined the roads. Fields that had begun to recover from the last war now trembled once again at the approach of soldiers. Some small folk hurriedly offered bread and salt, praying it would appease both sides. Late on the 3rd day, the jagged ruins of Summerhall loomed in the distance, a silhouette against the sunset. Rooks circled overhead, cawing. Smoke curled from campfires in the fields below, marking the presence of Robert's men. Rhaegar reined in his horse on a small rise, where he could survey the terrain. Rolling hills sloped toward the once proud palace, now blackened and half collapsed from the fateful fire decades ago. Arthur Dayne squinted at the horizon. "They've taken a defensible position among the rubble." Tywin and Barristan joined them. Tywin's eyes narrowed. "We can't let them settle in. I recommend we form battle lines immediately, force them to answer or flee." Barristan scratched his chin. "A direct assault might be costly, but if we wait, they can fortify further." Rhaegar lifted a hand, quieting them. "We'll offer them one last chance to yield," he said. "Arthur, take a handful of knights under a white flag. Summon Robert Baratheon to parley. If he refuses, we attack at dawn." Arthur bowed. "You will, your grace." The king watched as Arthur gathered a small delegation and rode down into the valley, a white banner held aloft. The sun dipped below the hills, bathing the ruins in a stark red glow. Rhaegar thought of the last time he had faced Robert, how the man had nearly killed him. Would he yield now, having mustered men in open defiance? They waited, tension coiling. After a time, Arthur returned, face grim. "They shot arrows at our feet, warning us away. We saw Robert among them." He brandished his warhammer. No words were exchanged, but the meaning was plain enough. Then Dosau. Rhaegar felt a surge of resignation and anger. He turned to his assembled commanders. "Then there's no more room for talk. At first light we position our men and advance. I want archers ready to pick off any forward guard. Once they're disrupted, we press the center. Barristan, you'll command the left flank. Tywin, take the right. I'll lead the center. We end this quickly. A solemn hush settled over the camp. In torchlit tents, men readied their armor, prayed to their gods, wrote letters to loved ones. Rhaegar walked through the rows, exchanging words with knights who had followed him since the trident, men who had bled for him before. Some seemed determined, others fearful. The memory of that brutal conflict weighed on them all. He tried to rest, but sleep eluded him. Hours seemed to crawl. At last, dawn broke in a blaze of pale light. The horns sounded, and the royal host formed into ranks. Rhaegar, astride his black warhorse, drew his sword, the metal shining in the early sun. The men waited for the signal. Across the field they could see Robert's forces stirring among the crumbling walls of Summerhall, stag banners flapping in a cold wind. Rhaegar took a breath. "Forward," he commanded, voice carrying. Drums pounded. The army advanced. The rebels fired arrows, a black volley slicing the sky. Some men fell, crying out. The crown's archers retaliated, and the shrieks of the wounded rose from both sides. The clang of steel began as the forces collided, a thunderous meeting of shields and spears. Dust and smoke clouded the air. In the center, Rhaegar drove his warhorse into the fray, sword flashing. He knocked aside a rebel spear, cut down another who lunged with a mace. Blood sprayed across his armor. He heard the roars of men locked in mortal struggle. A sense of dread and grim purpose gripped him. Not again, he thought. Not again. But it was happening again. War unleashed at the same place where Targaryen dreams had once burned to ash. He caught a glimpse of Robert's banner to the left, where the fighting was thickest. Rhaegar spurred his horse, weaving through the crush. Rebels tried to bar his way, but he batted them aside, ignoring the weight of his own exhaustion. The sting of an arrow grazed his shoulder, but he pressed on. Arthur Dayne and a few Kingsguard tried to follow, but the chaos swallowed them in separate pockets of battle. Then he saw Robert. The Lord of the Stormlands stood atop a small rise of rubble, warhammer in hand. His armor was plain steel, dented and splattered with gore, but his face blazed with the same relentless fury Rhaegar remembered. Their eyes locked across the distance. Time seemed to slow. Robert bellowed in rage, brandishing the hammer. Rhaegar tightened his grip on his sword. They closed on each other. The armies clashed around them, but for that moment, the din became white noise. Robert swung first, a powerful overhead blow that Rhaegar barely avoided by spinning his horse aside. The hammer crashed into the ground, sending sparks of stone. Rhaegar slashed at Robert's flank, but Robert blocked with the haft of his hammer, turning the blade away. The two circled, exchanging ferocious strikes. Rhaegar's heart pounded. This was the ghost of the trident come to life. Robert roared something unintelligible, perhaps a curse on House Targaryen. Rhaegar slashed again, scoring a deep cut along Robert's armor. The rebel lord staggered, but kept his grip. He returned with a horizontal swing that nearly sent Rhaegar tumbling from the saddle. The crash of steel rang in Rhaegar's ears. His horse reared, eyes rolling in panic. Rhaegar struggled to regain control, but Robert seized the moment, lunging forward. The hammer struck the horse's side. With a pained scream, the animal collapsed, pitching Rhaegar to the ground. Chaos engulfed him. Rhaegar rolled free of the flailing hooves, dust in his mouth. The ground churned with blood. He scrambled to his feet, sword in hand, just in time to see Robert charging with the hammer raised. Rhaegar sidestepped the blow, but it glanced off his breastplate, knocking the wind from him. He coughed, sank to one knee. Robert loomed overhead, eyes wild. In that instant, Rhaegar caught sight of a flash of white cloak, Arthur Dayne pushing through the melee, calling the king's name. Distracted, Robert hesitated, half turning to see the new threat. Rhaegar acted on reflex. He lunged upward, driving his sword toward Robert's exposed side. With a sickening crunch, the blade punched through the battered armor. Robert let out a strangled cry, staggering. His hammer slipped from his fingers. Rhaegar rose, chest heaving. He had wounded Robert. The man fell to his knees, blood seeping through cracked metal. For a heartbeat, Rhaegar saw not the fearsome warlord, but the wounded soul behind those raging eyes. Memories of their last clash echoed through his mind. But he had no illusions this time. Mercy had led them here again. As Robert slumped, Rhaegar stepped forward to disarm him completely, kicking the hammer aside. The fighting around them slowed as the rebels witnessed their leader fall. Some began to break, fleeing the field. Others charged forward in a desperate attempt to save him, but Arthur Dayne and the King's Guard formed a ring around Rhaegar. Robert gurgled, blood on his lips, glaring up at Rhaegar with undimmed hatred. "Finish it," he spat. A swirl of emotion tore through Rhaegar. Regret, resolve, pity. He had spared Robert once. This time, the realm could not afford another revolt. The war hammered that truth home. He raised his sword, hearing the distant shouts of men. For a moment, he hesitated, compelled by an urge to find another way. But that had been tried. Robert's wound already looked mortal, or near enough. The law of the realm demanded justice for treason. But it was more than the law. Rhaegar knew that as long as Robert drew breath, the Seven Kingdoms would never truly be at peace. Steeling himself, he brought the blade down with a swift, merciful stroke. Robert Baratheon's body slumped lifeless to the ground. Silence seemed to ring through Rhaegar's ears. The rebel leader was dead, for good and all. Cheers and cries of anguish alike rose from the battlefield. Rhaegar staggered back, sword dripping with blood. Arthur Dayne placed a hand on the king's arm to steady him. Around them, the momentum shifted decisively. The rebels, seeing Robert fall, either surrendered or fled. Word spread rapidly across the field. Robert Baratheon was dead. A hush settled over the battered armies. Smoke drifted from pockets of fire. Wounded men groaned in the mud. Rhaegar stood there, chest heaving. The weight of the deed crashing over him. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Surrendering knights laid down arms. Tywin's men hunted pockets of resistance, capturing stragglers. Arthur and Barristan helped Rhaegar to a makeshift command tent, where a maester tended his bruises and cuts. The king's expression was distant, haunted. By sunset, the battle was definitively over. Guards dragged in captured rebel lords, many wounded and shaking, the shock of defeat stark on their faces. Lord fell, Lord Errol, and others were among them, forced to their knees before the king. Arthur Dayne and Barristan Selmy looked to Rhaegar for direction, whether to spare or punish. Rhaegar lifted his gaze to the trembling men. Memories of the Mad King's cruelty flickered. He would not repeat that. But justice had to be served. "You rose in rebellion," Rhaegar said softly, his voice carrying across the silence of the camp. "I warned you of the consequences. Robert Baratheon lies dead by my hand. Let that be enough blood spilled this day." He paused, scanning their faces. Those who swear fealty now, who pledge never again to take up arms against the crown, may keep their lands, though your families will offer hostages to ensure your good behavior. If any refuse, they will be tried and executed. The realm cannot endure another cycle of war. The kneeling lords looked among themselves, battered and beaten. One by one they offered their swords, muttering oaths of loyalty. Whether sincere or born of fear, Rhaegar accepted them with grim weariness. Tywin nodded approvingly, though in his eyes lurked a cold gleam that suggested more severe measures would have been equally viable. That night, Lyanna arrived with additional supplies and healers, as the order had been for her to follow at a safe distance. She found Rhaegar in the remnants of the Summerhall courtyard, sitting near a collapsed archway. He still wore his dented armor, flecks of Robert's blood staining the metal. She approached slowly, kneeling beside him. "I heard," she whispered, tears in her eyes. "Robert is gone," Rhaegar said hollowly. He let out a shaky breath. "I had no choice. It was him or the realm." She reached for his hand, pulling him close. "He forced your hand." He released a ragged sigh, leaning his head against her shoulder. "Will this ever end?" he murmured. "When can we truly have peace?" She stroked his hair, holding back her own tears. She too had memories, though conflicted, of the man Robert had been. Maybe now, she offered, though the words felt thin. He was the last leader of that cause. They sat together in silence. The flicker of torches and the distant moans of the wounded filled the night. Rhaegar shut his eyes, exhausted body trembling with the aftershocks of battle. Lyanna stayed by his side, unwavering in her support, determined that no more ghosts would linger than necessary. Out among the ruins of Summerhall, the wind hissed through charred walls, as though whispering of the tragedies that had plagued House Targaryen. Yet within that hush, a promise stirred, a slim hope that this final clash might grant the Seven Kingdoms a lasting reprieve from the cycle of rebellion. When dawn broke, the crowning stag banners lay trampled in the dust. Robert Baratheon's remains had been prepared for transport back to Storm's End, to be buried in the tombs of his ancestors. The captured lords were confined under guard, awaiting a formal hearing in King's Landing. Rhaegar oversaw the dispatch of messages across the realm, announcing the end of Robert's uprising. He also commanded that the wounded rebels be treated, for he would not embrace cruelty. As the royal host regrouped to begin the journey home, Rhaegar stared once more at the scorched stones of Summerhall. In the hush of morning he whispered a prayer for the dead, both Targaryen and Baratheon, both those who had believed in him and those who had fought against him. He prayed for a time when the realm's fate would not hang on the point of a sword. Lyanna joined him, her fingers entwined with his. They stood together, gazing at the blackened rubble. The sky above them was clear, the rising sun painting the horizon in gentle gold. A sign, perhaps, of a fresh beginning after so many storms. They rode out in solemn procession. Behind them, the valley quieted, the echoes of steel fading into memory. Over the next weeks, tidings spread throughout the Seven Kingdoms that Robert Baratheon was gone, and his rebellion with him. Some stormlords cursed his name for dragging them into another ruinous conflict. Others quietly revered him as a tragic hero undone by the Targaryens once more. But no new champion rose in his stead. The last real threat to Rhaegar's rule had been extinguished. Upon returning to King's Landing, Rhaegar faced the daunting task of finalizing the realm's new shape. Treason trials were convened for the rebel lords who would not bend. Hostages from suspect houses were taken to ensure loyalty. The treasury strained to finance restitution for villages caught in the crossfire. Lyanna directed relief efforts in the Stormlands, seeking to temper the bitterness there. Gradually, the realm settled into an uneasy calm. The knowledge that King Rhaegar had decisively ended the Baratheon threat lingered in every corner of Westeros, a warning not to cross the Targaryen throne again. Still, the memory of the wars haunted Rhaegar. In the quiet hours, he felt the weight of each life lost. He took what comfort he could in Lyanna's presence, in the sound of his son Aemon's laughter echoing in the castle halls. Messages from the Night's Watch continued to speak of rising tension beyond the wall, but for now, the realm had no appetite for further conflict. At times, Rhaegar strummed a mournful tune on his harp, thinking of the future, of a danger from the cold north that might dwarf any mortal rebellion. Perhaps the realm's unity now, however fragile, would be the best defense against such a threat. With Robert Baratheon laid to rest, the Seven Kingdoms belonged to King Rhaegar, I Targaryen, and Queen Lyanna Stark. They had blazed a path of love, defiance, and bloodshed to seize a chance at forging a better realm. Whether that realm would weather the storms of winter and the hidden horrors that might yet come, only the turning seasons would decide. For now, they persisted, bound by duty and hope, the living embodiment of ice and fire. No songs could neatly capture the cost of their ascension, nor the uncertain promise that stretched ahead. But songs would try, weaving tales of the Dragon King and the Wolf Queen who fought for a dream of peace in a land so often consumed by war. And in those songs, perhaps, the seeds of a brighter tomorrow would find fertile ground to take root and grow.